Hello and welcome to the MediaNama's discussion on the impact of uh, the IT rules 2021 on news in India. We'd like to thank Google for the support for this discussion and our community partners, Webinar and the Center for Internet and Society for the support. Uh, it's been quite uh, quite a crazy start to the rollout of the IT rules in India, and most media publishers have received letters asking for details of their grievance officer and their self-regulatory organization, and as have news aggregators. I think if you might remember, in addition to this, recently social media platforms were sent a note by MeitY requesting them to remove mentions of the Indian variant of COVID-19 from their social media platforms, and this affects news as well. So, with the IT rules in place, will such requests also be sent directly to online news platforms? How will the power equation between the government and news aggregators change going forward? How will grievance redressal impact online news, and and what kind of capacity is required for that? How will it impact foreign news publications available online in India? We hope to discuss all of this and much, much more in due course of this discussion. We've got a fantastic set of speakers who've looked at these issues and many of whom are impacted by these issues. So this discussion is divided into two parts. The first part will discuss the IT rules and their impact on online news publishers. In the second part, we'll discuss news aggregators. So just starting with the first session on the impact on news, I'd like to bring in first Abhinandan Sekri, who I call patient zero for online news regulation in India, since News Laundry, which he's co-founded, was impacted first by an FDI requirement. So Abhinandan, can you walk us through what happened? How did you come to be governed by FDI regulations, and what was the confusion at that point in time?
So I'll just tell you what happened. Also, I think it's important to also discuss the motivation of what happened, why it happened. Because I had mentioned to you, I was a part of I think that there was a round of discussions that an agency was doing to put together a white paper or a policy prescription on IT rules and the regulatory framework. And in that question answer session, I had said that one of the problems that I find in a lot of the discussions is that we start off with the assumption that the rules set are in good faith. They are to make the system more robust. And as long as you go with that assumption, the whole discussion tends to be flawed. Because I don't believe they're in good faith. So it started off in 2011 when we had the idea of starting a digital media platform. I mean, I won't get into the whole thing. That Madhu was my boss at India Today when I used to be at Newstrack, and we had been toying with the idea of doing a show which critiques the media for the longest time, but nobody wanted to put it on air. So we said, and then by then, there was enough of internet had become enough of a thing. It was still in single digits, the penetration, but we said, chalo, if no one wants to put on air, at least we can put a show out online. And then, my co-founder, and we used to run a production house, said that rather than put one show on, let's just start a media critique platform. So we said, chalo, let's start it. Now at that time, we ran a production house. And that production house made shows for everyone from Doordarshan to Discovery Channel to Good Times to Lifestyle. It was non-fiction programming, but not news. Now, and that had one of my old friends had a stake in that, 6% stake from his entity in Singapore. So when we started News Laundry, we got a letter saying that you are news and you have this FDI. Therefore, you cannot take this FDI because you have to come through the FIPB process. What now is called, I think FIFB was called FIPB back then. From promotion, it's called I don't know if they changed that name. That one word. So I had at that time gone to North Block. We responded saying that we don't because we are digital, and we showed the rules. That as it's written, in the ministry's own documents, that it is for broadcast and print. And we said, we are neither broadcast nor print. And then there was a to and fro, and the lady who met us, the bureaucrat there, she said, okay, let me take this back and get back to you. We went 2 or 3 times. We said, we don't come under this. Then he said, no, you do, you have to go through the FIPB process. So the first I went through the FIPB process in retrospect. But what we figured was that until that, it would be, but we didn't want small screens as a production house to come under FIPB because we had no intention of doing news. So that is when News Laundry was made into a separate entity. That News Laundry will be the news because production house had no interest in getting into anything. They were doing non-news frivolous programming, which was good business. And then we separated the two. And then when we had to seriously get, investment from Omidyar Network in 2014, then I went FIPB under Mr. Modi had become FIFB. And then I went and met the gentleman who was heading FIFB, the bureaucrat, and I said, look, we had said this last time also, this is the rule for broadcast and print, and we are not either of those. And he said, okay, let me get back to you. Then he called another lady who was a director, and they very honestly said, look, no bureaucrat is going to change a file that has already opened. So basically, ek bar file khul gayi hai. So they said, what you're saying makes sense, but it doesn't matter. The file has said that you will come under the regulatory framework. Therefore, you have to do the application, this big thadda that you put, I don't know how many copies of your article of association, cap table. And in fact, they had stuff at that time that you have to give the passport photocopy or something of the final beneficiary of your investment fund. Now, the Pierre Omdiar's wife sits on the board. So he said, I'm not going to give you my wife's passport copy. The kind of stuff that was required was bizarre. And that is but we continued to challenge it, but I realized that either I go to court or I shut up and carry on doing my work. Little realizing that this would have a repercussion on the entire industry going forward. Because from 2012 to 2021, now we've come a long way, now you can't go back and undo all that. And I also have a theory that because I know there were other outfits that also had foreign money. And I have a theory that why I was sent the RBI letter and not others. Because the cops had been in my office about a year before that anyway, on an unrelated issue.
Okay. So I'm just curious about whether you had any conversations after 2018, which is when when the Ministry of INB had put together a committee to look at regulation of online news, which was then scrapped and then passed on to MeitY. I don't know anyone who's had conversations with them once that mandate was passed to MeitY. Did you happen to have any such conversations?
Oh, we have not had any conversation. No one asked us anything. I have spent long times dealing with some very reasonable and, polite bureaucrats in the DIPT and in the Ministry of Information Broadcasting. But like I said, the bureaucracy works once the file says X, then it is X. And funnily enough, Nikhil, I have a very thick file on my entire case. I have 2 letters from the Ministry of Information Broadcasting, both within 6 to 8 months. One putting me in the category of print, one putting me in the category saying you're not print, you're broadcast.
So we are going to get into that part of it a little later, because it seems that both the norms under the Press Council of India and the Code of Conduct for cable TV regulations apply to online. But we'll get into that dual regulation, because the problem that you've identified as an initial problem still seems to exist. But I'm just curious, because we are an entity that is also potentially impacted. And are you complying with the government's mechanism for registration and grievance redressal? In a sense, is there a self-regulatory organization that exists and is registered for digital media with the ministry? What are the challenges you're facing with that?
Well, we set up DigiPub last year, but like the conversations of DigiPub started about 3 or 4 years ago.
Yes.
But because everyone from Dhanya to Scroll to everybody was in different cities and we were all busy running our operations, we could not register it. But Dhanya has the whole trail mail. It was we had decided to set this up long time ago when it was clear that legacy media is going to throw you under the bus, and those signs were clear to me from very beginning. It was
Hmm.
clear,
Hmm.
and they have done that on 3 occasions, which I shall, at some point, hopefully, if you ask me, I'll tell you about. But so we are complying because if a order comes from the ministry, because policy is the government's mandate, it is not the court's mandate.
Hmm.
You can challenge a policy saying it violates whatever constitutional rights or anything else. But until that happens, you comply. So most members of DigiPub are complying. I mean, I'm sure each of them has their own decisions, but the ones that I have spoken to, many are complying. But we have put a note, because you have to upload it as a PDF, sign and upload. We have added that, in legalese, I can read it out, that we hold a right to challenge this in court as and when required. We reserve our privilege of right to challenge this. So it is kind of under protest because this is in court, right? Dhanya, Quint, the leaflet, no, sorry, live law,
Live law.
and Pratidhwani.
Yes.
I mean, the wire, they're all in court. So we'd like to see what comes
But
of that. But until that, as far as, and DigiPub was set up to be a regulatory framework way before these rules came about. That was
right.
the intention of DigiPub.
Right, but have you registered as an SRO? Have you had a meeting with the ministry? Because they
No, we
said
haven't.
that
We've
they've
sent.
met. They said they've met digital publishers, digital news
Actually,
publishers.
they have worded it very interestingly. They said they have heard from digital news publishers about having set up whatever. They haven't said they'd met us. In fact, when the DigiPub had a last meeting, there was that, has the government lied or have they not lied?
Hmm.
Then when we read it carefully, they said they haven't claimed to have met us. They said 60 digital platforms that represents up to 60, which we are the largest. Like we represent about 45 or 50 digital platforms and professionals around the country. So they said they haven't said they've met us. They have said that they have heard from us.
Hmm.
So, or something along those lines, which is true. I mean, we have sent
Right.
them emails, we have sent them letters requesting meetings. We have said that we have this, panel of the second level.
But just to push you a little on this, is there a self-regulatory organization for digital publishers?
DigiPub?
No, is there any? Because they need to be registered with the government.
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by registered with the government. You have to inform the government and they have to approve as per the new laws.
Hmm.
That's up to the government to, tell us whether we are registered with them or not, or what that means. We are registered Section 25 company with a board, with a panel, which is of people of impeccable integrity and public service, who we have set as a self-regulatory mechanism, like many other, like broadcast has.
Hmm.
Now, whether the government wants to acknowledge it or not is up to them, but we have that. DigiPub has that.
Okay. Manu, you've gone to court challenging these rules. Why have you gone to court?
Hi, Nikhil. Good afternoon. Yes.
Live Law was the first, I believe, to go to court challenging these rules. And, there has also been some question about whether specialized news publications such as yours are actually news and current affairs. So how did you come about taking the decision to challenge these rules in court?
See, these rules, on the face of it, they are illegal and unconstitutional. Because see, these rules are framed, if you go by the framework of the rules, these rules are issued by the government exercising the powers under the Information Technology Act. So the first and foremost thing, before getting into the aspects of constitutionality and free speech infringement, etc., the government lacks the power to frame these rules to regulate digital media under the Information Technology Act. Because the Information Technology Act is not the parent act. The statute is not meant to control digital media as well as online publishers. So they have invoked powers under, they say that the rules have been framed under invoking section 69 and 79 and the general rulemaking power of section 87, etc. So this is the fundamental problem with the rules, because they lack the authority. The government lacks the authority to make executive rules to control digital media by using the powers under the Information Technology Act. So this is the first and foremost apparent problem with the rules. Apart from that, the effect of the rules on free speech, on the functioning of the independence of media platforms, all these are there. So when we read the rules, and so when we had a discussion, it was clear to us that these rules are violating many statutory provisions, many fundamental principles of law, and also infringing the fundamental media freedom. So we got the assistance from the Internet Freedom Foundation as well. So who provided us with the legal assistance to do the drafting and the searching, etc. So we decided to approach the Kerala High Court because that is our jurisdictional High Court. And before we approached, I think the Wire had approached the Delhi High Court, and I think on the next day, I think we filed the case. So during the hearing itself, I mean, this was our main argument. The government lacks the power to frame the rules, as well as another during the as you are mentioning, whether specialized media agencies will come under these rules. So the court was basically asking, will law portals, because we are essentially doing courtroom reporting. We are reporting the courtroom exchanges as well as we are reporting the judgments and other analysis of the judicial developments. So the court was asking, so basically they are reporting judgments and what is happening in the court. So how can they be brought under these rules? So there was such a query from the bench. Anyway, so the court has passed an interim order in our favor that there should not be any coercive action against Livelo as well as its editorial board and as well as other employees under Part 3 of the rules.
So how do you think they're going to impact press freedom, Manu?
See, if you see the structure of the rules, so firstly, the rules has formulated an oversight mechanism by the government. There's a three-tier enforcement mechanism. So first, the media platform itself has to appoint a grievance redressal officer and to address the grievance, etc. Then there is a so-called self-regulating body. So if the complainant is not satisfied with the response from the media platform, he can escalate it to the so-called self-regulating body. And further, it can be escalated to the government level. So there is an interdepartmental committee, and which is having an oversight of the media content, of the functioning of the media organization. So it comprises completely of members from the ministries, I think Ministry of Law Ministry and I think 2-3 other ministries. So basically they are secretary level officers of these ministries. So so basically you have they have an oversight of your content, and they can pass orders to modify or take down your content on the basis of any complaint. So if you see the scheme of the act, so for whenever a person files a complaint with the grievance redressal officer of the media platform, you have to give an acknowledgement within 24 hours, and the complaint has to be redressed within, say, like 15 days, I think. And you have to give periodic reports to the government regarding the complaints, etc. So the government will have a record of what all complaints you received, what all actions you have taken. So basically, you are giving the government a peep into your functioning, your internal functioning, and you have to submit periodic returns, periodic complaints reports, etc. And this can be taken to the government as well. And also, there is another provision in the rules. I think it's Rule 16 or something, where the government, where the interdepartmental committee, they have the power to issue extraordinary ex parte orders for takedown directly on the first instance itself. And it can be passed without hearing you, and you have no review mechanism. There is no appellate mechanism. So this is basically the scheme of the act. I mean the rules.
So Manu, if I had to play devil's advocate, there are standard and recognized Press Council of India guidelines. There are standard and recognized guidelines under the Cable Television Act,
right,
which are applicable to traditional and print media. And don't these grievances and the orders from the government, they have to be considered under these rules? And secondly, the government orders are also restricted to Article 19(2). So why is it unreasonable for these restrictions to apply?
so when we talk about the reasonableness of restrictions, we always have to keep in mind the doctrine of proportionality, whether these restrictions are proportionate enough. That is the main test of constitutionality. So of course, I mean, no one is saying that online media platforms have a special immunity, or they should be left to do whatever they want. That is not the intention. Of course, there should be some regulation. Content should be responsible. There should be responsible reporting, and in accordance with all the laws of the land. No one is disputing that. But we are concerned about the scheme of oversight mechanism which has been created under the Act, and which has a disproportionate impact. So they can see, for example, I'll tell you with certain hypothetical examples. We are doing courtroom reporting, and there could be some persons who there could be certain vested interests who may not want certain court observations or certain court reports to come out in public domain. Maybe if, for example, if a judge is making certain outrageous remarks in the courtroom, he may not be wanting that to come out in the public domain, and we are reporting that. And someone is making a complaint that we are making, and in fact, our report is fabricated or fake news. And imagine a situation where we are the only reporter. So how do you verify this? How do you verify? So someone is making a complaint, and this complaint can be escalated to the level of the ministry, to the government itself. And if, for example, if we are an organization which is not in the good books of the government, they can easily take an action. And there is no means to verify or no means to prove your point, etc. Because basically the government itself is acting as the judge and executioner. That is the scheme of the Act. There is no independent adjudicating authority. The government itself can be the yes, Abhinandan.
Sorry, if I may come in,
Yes.
like Manu was saying, Nikhil, this also, the way it's worded, anything that's defamatory can also go to this mechanism, right?
Right.
Right now, there is someone who decides if it's defamatory. They're called the courts of India. Right now, one of the upholders of freedom of speech, the Times Group, has sent us a legal notice because we're calling out what they consider journalism on prime time. So, and we are taking that on in court. So has Sakal Times. They in fact filed an FIR against our journalist. That FIR has been quashed by the Bombay High Court. So there are this whole misconception that digital doesn't come under any rules, that we are as if we are the island of Kailasa, that we are we come under the same rules that the whole country comes under. Yeah, there are defamation laws. I mean, and we deal with them. So I think it's ironic that the Times Group has sent us a defamation notice. Now, what can they do? They don't have to go to court and argue it out. This bunch of bureaucrats can decide that no, this is defamatory, take it down. Phir courts ka kya fayda? Then what are the courts there for?
So essentially, it's an additional mechanism.
Right.
But one can also, but Manu, one can also argue that this kind of an adjudicatory mechanism is meant to reduce the burden on courts. Isn't that the case?
But they don't have the expertise.
See, exactly. And see, the thing is that the test of every adjudicatory mechanism is that it should be independent. It should be independent from the executive. That is the fundamental principle. And here the executive itself, the government itself, is acting as the adjudicating authority. You don't have an independent agency to adjudicate the issue. And probably the government itself can be having a vested interest. And see, another issue which I foresee which can arise is that there could be certain media agencies or media platforms which are aligned with the government, or maybe there could be certain portals which the government itself is promoting, and maybe to in a very highly competitive market. So it's not a level playing field itself. So the government can, I mean, there are possibilities of these rules being applied in a very uneven manner, and maybe to eliminate the competitors and to promote the pro-executive, the pro-establishment media platforms. These rules can be applied in a very uneven manner. That can also happen. And the main concern is that these rules have a lot of potential for abuse and misuse. And it constitutes an... Yes, Nikhil.
No. So sorry, I was just going to go to Kawaljeet on this because just to take off from what Abhinandan and Manu have said, Kawaljeet, why do you think the TV industry didn't push back against the cable TV norms? because they also are effectively a similar mechanism.
I can't go back so much in time when these laws came in for TV. I think it's 94. But I have to say, this code of conduct has just included the whole cable television network act for digital, right? And if you go down the program code, which digital now gets covered, it's so subjective. Like, for example, I have a few written down, offend. So you can't do any programming which offends good taste or decency, right?
Exactly.
Like, you start with that. Who is there to interpret what it means? If you show ministers having cow urine on screen, right? Is this good taste or not? And the logic is that if you are against code of conduct, anyone can file a complaint against you, and then you go down these levels that are escalating. And when there's a level 3 which sits on top, level 1 and level 2 mean nothing, right? Because anytime level 1 or level 2 rule out, so level 1 is your own self-regulation, level 2 is a statutory body you may be part of. If both of them rule in your favor, and the complainant can go to level 3, which is the oversight committee, like Manu is saying, and they can just say this is not okay. So while this programming code came for TV a long time back, the way the new IT Act has been structured is very different. Giving power, again, like Manu rightly said, to an oversight committee, which doesn't have to give any explanation. Because for the cable industry, if they, and NDTV has gone through this over and over again, from the Pathankot attack to, there are several cases where this cable and television network rules were applied on NDTV selectively. Everyone covers the same way all these events, but NDTV is singled out. But you have some recourse, right? That case is still going on in the Supreme Court. Here, the new rules are clearly, levels off at a minister or a joint secretary who is making the rulings without giving you an opportunity to, even have a hearing. So, and for whatever it's worth, news on digital or news in general is very ephemeral, right? So if you get a notification to take down anything, while you challenge, go to the courts or anything, that value of the news may have gone. And with these new rules, that can be affected. You can get a call or a notification from the ministry saying, based on the IT rules, take down this piece of content, which is, they have used section 69A a couple of times in the new rules, but it is effectively that a dictat can come to you, take this down without giving you a proper hearing, and then you have to first take it down, then you take some recourse, right? So just extraordinary, the new rules which have come in, and obviously everyone should fight and is fighting against it now.
So Kawaljeet, Advait had a couple of questions. Advait?
Hi, Kawaljeet. So based on your experience, what were the sort of arguments that the government was making? Let's not take India's daughter, because that is the most public thing. But what else, if we look at the Twitter example, all these are essentially orders that go on email or are just exchanged between the two entities, as opposed to anything public or a public court order. And the other question I had is, essentially the interdepartmental committee can take up cases on a suo motu basis, right, on its own. How do you think that plays out when the government has powers over your TV license and your website? Do you think it'll censor your website more than the TV, because TV is anyway live? You can't. What's permanent on the internet, that broadcast, can ask you to edit those videos also. Do you think that is the powers it's been given?
Yeah, like you see, it's too wide. These new rules, because while there is a lot of detail on the escalation matrix, a lot of points around what the code of conduct is, you are negating all that by saying that in extraordinary cases, suo motu, they can take a call. Just one acting authority on behalf of the ministry can take a call, ask something to be taken down. Then they get an opportunity, that one officer gets an opportunity to go to the committee in 48 hours to explain why it was taken down. If the committee feels that, this was not worth taking down, then you get permission to reverse it, right? So yeah, it is too blanket, it's too onerous. This can and will be misused over a period of time. It's too heavy-handed in that sense. And sorry, I didn't get your first question. If you want to clarify.
First question is, what over the years, with the kind of battles that any TV news channel would have faced, especially NDTV, What are some of the arguments that the government makes? Because in some cases it can say national security, in other cases it's saying public decency. You said that you're still
again,
fighting these cases. Why are these cases still going on? If
see, they have so many, like I said, the cable television network rules have so many of these points which are very vague. They can use any of them to, ask you to take it down. Then you go to the court, you obviously work on, Article 19, you say freedom of press. You can't do whataboutery here, right? Like, I can't say like Indian Express did, or in television case, Times Now did the same, or Republic did the same, because they have singled you out. You have to fight on the merit of their claim, right? So, and by the way, all these cases are still in the court. God knows when they will be ruled on. Thankfully, there is some protection given to us that no coercive action should be taken. So that's the only relief we have, and this was on the television side. Now this gets extended to the whole digital side. Over and over again, all the things that we have been doing on TV, the compliances become as important. And one of the things we should discuss is look at the compliance list also to just fulfill what is required. And while TV is again like live, so it quickly gets over, on digital everything is residing. I'll give you an example. One of the cable television network rules is that you can't carry half truths, right? So for example, and I have an example in mind. So Gautam Gambhir just today was found guilty of hoarding those drugs, right? Those whatever, Fabiflu or whatever. So today he was found guilty, right? We have an article from weeks ago which clearly says he has been accused of it. He was distributing it, right? So now he can file a complaint saying this is half truth, right? So let's say he got acquitted today, right? Like he was not holding it. So I have an article which says he was accused. It's a half truth because the full truth is that eventually he got acquitted, right? I'll have to take down everything, right? If you think of the steps that can be followed now. And I don't want to give ideas, but this is too overreaching. Anyone can file a complaint. The compliances are saying that not only do you have to respond in 24 hours, you have to take a decision in 15 days. Everything you do has to be put on a publicly displayed website. So you have to say that you got this complaint. You have to say what action was taken. What was your response? It just seems, a lot of paperwork and just too onerous.
Yeah, so, I often say that these rules require every media channel, or at least even the new media, independent media, to have a BPO center attached behind them, doing all this compliance.
Yeah, we don't know. If you just see the number of people tagging NDTV on Twitter, and for every kind of reason, and you just think that 1% of them will actually file a formal complaint on our site based on these new rules. Yeah, a BPO probably is what we'll need. And you can't write any technical or technology based filters, right? Like if this is the kind, like you send it to a junior team, because every complaint has to be taken with the same seriousness, where a legal guy has to be, consulted, a compliance officer has to be consulted, an editorial person will have to be consulted. And, again, you are required to give your editor's name to the government, because at the end of the day, they will be hauled up if you deny or not agree to many things. So the compliances are crazy that way. So yeah, PPO of lawyers.
Abhinandan, as editors and more on the editorial side and the business side, what do you think this does to the institution of an editor? Because anyway, this editor had to before play the social milieu game, and today they've got to make sure they're answerable to committees and SROs and things like that. What do you think happens with the institution of editor if they're going to be bothered by all of this now? Anyone of you can.
That I guess you should get that feedback from an editor. I'm not the editor, but I'm guessing that as and when these things come up, it's going to be of concern to editors as well, because how it plays out can severely impact how reporters actually start reporting. I mean, it could have a chilling effect. And what Kawaljit said, that the poor taste, if you remember 66A, which was struck down finally, had very similar wording. So I think that's already the case of one of the parties that have gone to court, that on the same logic, this should be struck down, because even that had causing annoyance, in poor taste. So it was exactly the same. They've just named it something else.
So before I go to Neha on this, Manu, this exact same thing to you, like some of these, you might challenge it on the basis of 66A and say that the wording is vague, but it has applied to both print as well as TV for a long time. How do you reconcile that in court?
See, you were mentioning press council rules and the cable TV, the program code under the Cable TV Act. Even if you read through those, the journalistic code under the Press Council Act and as well as the program code, even they are very subjective. As Kavaljit was pointing out, they have expressions like not in good taste or half truths, etc., and which are very subjective and vague. And this was the exact reason why Supreme Court struck down Section 66A in the Shreya Singhal case. And I believe that even the program code had a case to be challenged in the Supreme Court. I don't know why it was not taken up. I'm not commenting on that, but it is my firm belief that even the program code, which has been made applicable to the digital media as well, suffers from the same problem of vagueness and overbreadth. And if you take the Press Council Act, what is the consequence? See, if you go by the structure of the Press Council Act as well, even if there is any violation of the journalistic, the code of ethics under the Press Council Act, there is no legal or any penal coercive action. There is no consequence as such. But here, when you compare compare it with the IT rules, you'll be the consequences are very grave. You'll be faced. I mean, they can basically shut down your platform eventually by gradual action. So you have to keep in mind the consequences as well when we think about the when we compare both these aspects. And under the program code, how many actions have been taken by the ministry against television channels? There is Kavaljit was mentioning the example of NDTV, and last year the ministry took action against Sudarshan TV after a lot of force was applied by the Supreme Court with respect to that case. There was a program by
Suresh Chavanke.
Yes, exactly. The UPSC, exactly, the UPSC Jihad program. And even in that case, I mean, that was a fit case to be acted under the program code, and the government was sleeping over that. I mean, it was a clear case. I mean, that was an episode which was clearly violating many provisions of the program code, but there was no action taken. And the action came only after the Supreme Court made several observations and after a lot of nudging and pushing by the Supreme Court. So this is also an example of selective. So this can be an example how the IT rules can also apply. If we go by the example of how the program code was applied in the case of Sudarshan channel, if a similar approach is followed, I think Abhinandan was mentioning about the selective application. So that can happen with respect to media, I mean, the online portals as well.
So I'll bring Neha in a second. Kuril, wanted to understand from your perspective as an investor in the media space in India, how do these regulations impact media investment and the operations of independent media in the country? I mean, how are you viewing this conversation that we're having?
Well, Nikhil, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm audible, right?
Loud and clear.
Sure. So I think it's no doubt that obviously things are very challenging, and if you take this conversation along with all the FDI regulations that are in place and have been clarified as recently as a few months ago on what and how much and where you can invest, obviously it begs an investor to take a second look at the entire space and see whether from an investor's perspective, what is the potential return versus all the trouble that I'm going to take on as being part of being an investor, being part of the board, having those duties as a board member. Even if I'm not on the board, what is the attractiveness of this sector as a whole? So obviously I will want to do those weigh those against each other, and what will happen and what has already happened, and I think Abhinandan would be witness to that also, is that there is funding that has dried up, right? And forget venture funding, even within the country, there are very few people who are going to touch news per se as an investment opportunity, simply because it comes with so many other things that are attached to it, other baggages that are attached to it. And most investors, unless you are a very, very highly mission-oriented investor, you are not going to touch it with a barge pole also. which brings me to what is likely to happen. What is likely to happen is that investors who were perhaps interested in this space are going to play some kind of a proxy investment, kind of saying that, okay, if this is an intelligent audience that was consuming so and so kind of media, then what else is it that this audience consumes as content? So perhaps you will look at other areas which are equally impactful, like news, but are not categorized as news. It could be things like educational content, it could be things like healthcare related content, but not healthcare news. So obviously, again, people will do a trade-off between whether you want to do news or you want to do just impactful and meaningful content, and that's how it's going to play out. And obviously, what's also going to happen is that there will be emergence of innovative structurings. Obviously, there will be a lot of innovative structuring that will happen in places which are already invested in and need to get restructured and come under that 26% limit slowly and steadily. And also going forward, structuring on how do you kind of set up offshore structures, etc., at arm's length, so that there is no subsidiary to so to speak of, and therefore kind of play that investment role over there. Obviously, it is easier said than done, and because one could always argue that if even in a arm's length kind of a thing, if the sum and substance of the entire work being done is within the country and is news within the country, then is it just a facade or some kind of thing? So obviously, all investors right now uh, are pretty much waiting and watching. Obviously, we are still doing investments, but we are not doing investments in hardcore news kind of a space. And this goes across the board. Of course, that also opens up one more thing: is that what is a potential way for funding to happen? Then that is your domestic philanthropists, domestic grants, etc. Could there be newer, more responsible grant-led models that could come up? And I think there are a few players who are doing that.
So in essence, are you of the opinion that there's been an end to exits for digital media in India?
And I'm by nature a very optimistic person, so I will never say there is an end. Obviously, I mean, there are lots of legal minds who can put together their minds and figure out ways to exit. But it is a challenging atmosphere, and because the visibility 5 years hence or 7 years hence, which is the typical life of a fund, is so hazy. If my visibility is hazy, I'm also going to be very, non-committal right now, and I will look at other green shoots that are emerging, which might be equally impactful. Abhinandan, you were saying something.
Yeah, Nikhil, actually, when you asked the equivalence of, since there were equally vaguely worded regulatory frameworks for legacy media, so, the same are extended to digital. So basically, I think the point you were making, playing devil's advocate, is like, if they're equally vaguely worded for them, why should they not be for you? Well, you can't let the cancer of vague wording spread. It should be shrunk. Now, if legacy did not challenge it, they had their reasons. You see, because it is, I mean, they depend on their uplinking and downlinking, depends on licensing. We don't depend on licensing. And we are in the brave new world. We are not in the meek, compliant world. So
in
like,
that sense,
if like a new temple or new mall comes up, that we will not allow people of a certain religion or caste. Now you see, you can't allow that. No, but some temples have this rule. Get those temples to 2021. No, why are you taking the mall back to 1920? And I'll give you a simple example. When the FDI rules were announced, we carried an article on it. The body that claims to represent digital media, which in my view doesn't, and it should not make that claim, welcomed this FDI liberalized. How is it liberalized? 100%
if I may,
and you're welcoming it. Now the point is that everyone has their own reasons for doing that, but rather than say that we will let the lethargy and the bad reasoning and the meekness of legacy media extend into digital media, we should say the progressiveness and the combativeness of digital media should infect legacy media. They are the ones who need to be cured, not us.
If I may remind you, the Hindustan Times wrote an editorial welcoming these guidelines,
What are the Times of India?
The Times of India also.
The Times of India as well.
Yeah, and several others.
And they said that this brings a level playing field in terms of media in India. But so I need to bring in Neha. She's been waiting for a long time. Neha, let me start with an easy question. How do you legally define news?
Nikhil, we had to go back and spend a lot of time researching this because there is no answer. So it's far from being an easy question. But I think the position of law, as far as the law goes, there is no legal definition of news. So what courts have done, including the Supreme Court in a couple of cases in the 1980s, has said in the absence of a legal definition, we're going to look at just how you understand news, how the dictionary understands news, right? So they looked at the Oxford Dictionary, some edition of the Oxford Dictionary. And basically then that's the understanding and the definition that you use to legally define news as well. And this kind of interpretation is also not new, because if you the law itself says that you should define terms at first literally, and you should first understand them literally without without thinking about what the intent or the purpose or things like that would be. So given that there is a literal definition or a common everyday definition of news, then that's the one that you go by, where it's about new information about new events, recent events, something that's recently happened, and you're helping people make sense of what's recently happened. Then that's just the way you and I would understand news is the way the law would understand news.
So I mean, clause 2M of the rules say that news and current affairs content includes newly received or noteworthy content, including analysis, especially about recent events, primarily of socio-political, economic, or cultural nature, made available over the internet or computer networks, and any digital media shall be news and current affairs with the content, substance, purpose, import, and meaning of such information is in the nature of news and current affairs content. Doesn't it sound like a recursive definition?
It is, and I think you will find that come through. I think you'll find that come through in the publisher definition as well. I think this instance of it being a self-referencing definition comes through in a couple of different places in the rules as well. But if you were to just look at it the way the court would look at it, then they would just say, okay, this is we're going to understand news to mean the way a common person would just understand news, and likewise for current affairs, because these are not really terms that statutorily have been defined. So in the absence of a statute, you have to look at everyday understanding.
So I mean, I'm just thinking of, let's say, something like a Cricinfo, which basically reports on cricket, or let's say something like an Exchange for Media, which reports purely on advertising in India. What about, let's say, someone who releases a documentary on Ambedkar, Jayanti? Would all of these be then treated as news and current affairs? Would Amit Verma's Seen and the Unseen, which discusses, politics and so many other subjects, would that also be under news and current affairs? I mean, who gets impacted here? So and who doesn't? I think the easier question is who doesn't get impacted.
Got it. No, look, I think the intent. Okay, so let's pick up the Cricinfo question first, right? My personal view is that I think that somebody like a Cricinfo would be affected by the rules that we're seeing today. I think Cricinfo also identifies itself as a new news platform. If you go around and play around their website, and I think what they're doing is there is definitely the element of reportage, right? There is new information. You're communicating that new information. I would though make a distinction between news and websites or podcasts or blogs or forums where the primary purpose for something else, right? If the primary purpose is meant to be a lot of analysis, if it goes beyond the function of just just sort of reporting. The primary function of news being to help you make sense of what's happening. One, to keep you updated, and second, then to make you to help you make sense of the world around you. I do think that the point that you're making or that you're leaning towards is a valid one, because the rules themselves are fairly widely worded. So there is a risk, if you look at the way if you just go by the letter of the law, there is very much a risk of the scope being wide. But I don't think that that's the intention, honestly. I think the intention is to look at news in a more in a more sort of tightly bound way, I would say. But yeah, there is. I wouldn't rule out the risk of the fact that the rules could just, if you just read the rules, the import could be wider.
So I mean, just to push on this point a little bit more, I remember about 6-7 years ago, 8 years ago maybe, there was a site called commonflow.com, which was a real estate portal, and they used to run a blog which used to have the latest real estate news alongside it. Would that blog also then be would CommonFlow also have to register as a news and current affairs portal?
Yeah, I think it would. Look, Nikhil, honestly, this all just becomes a question of fact, right? You'll actually have to, I can pick up for you what one of these cases said, right? Like, the definition itself is super wide. News means tidings, new information of recent events, new occurrences as a subject of report or talk, right? News means information, intelligence, knowledge is generally understood as a report of recent occurrences, reports of happenings of recent occurrences of varied character, such as political, social, moral, religious, so on and so forth. I mean, you could, because the definition of news itself is so wide, then each of these scenarios that you and I will go through will just become will become a question of fact.
Manu, you wanted to comment on something?
No, I just wanted to add to one thing. In fact, this very question was raised in our case by the High Court bench, that whether you will be covered under the ambit of news portal as per the IT rules, whether live law, which is only doing specialized law reporting, whether you will be under the. So this question had come from the bench. So I just wanted to mention that. And as Neha was saying, this is a very wide definition, and anything can come under. Even if, for example, like a portal doing only matrimonial information, even that can be robbed in, probably by extent. I mean, if you extend the rules.
Right? Yeah, because there's nothing in the law that says it has to be of a particular nature, right? It doesn't say anything, nor does it tell you the opposite. It doesn't say if you're super specialized, then we're sort of keeping you out of it. We're thinking about this just in terms of being sort of traditional media, in the sense the law is not telling you any of these different things. You're just saying that if it's news that's of public importance, now who is to say what is of public importance? You're giving a whole bunch of different ideas. So yeah, I imagine these will just be questions that get asked depending on
just on the grievance redressal piece, Kawaljit, yours is a very popular channel, and probably one of the highest traffic news sites in the country. What is your estimate in terms of the grievances that you might receive, especially since you might also be the target of a lot of grievances, which might be coordinated? What sort of a setup do you think you need to address those?
Well, it's hard to say right now. I mean, the only benchmark we see is from the feedback mail we get, and what we see on Twitter, which runs into hundreds of messages a day, at least, if not thousands. So I'm hoping that this doesn't translate 1:1 as formal complaints when these things take off. But certainly even 20, 30 complaints a day itself will bring down the whole system. You're talking multiple compliance officers, you're talking multiple legal people at separate editorial section which is handling these kind of things. It looks like a nightmare to us. I mean, again, like I said, yeah,
this almost sounds as if sure. I mean, I'm just thinking this almost seems to be a case where there's a scope for a grievance redressal DDoS attack on someone.
Yeah, like Advait was saying, you may need a BPO just to handle it. But can I say this compliance and the paperwork is a very small problem in front of the new rules itself, which is completely stopping the freedom of speech and letting press do its job. I think the paperwork, how to handle this, will become a smaller problem if you start getting diktats which say you cannot cover it, or this coverage is not okay, or take down these articles or videos. I think that becomes a much bigger problem. But the legality and the process and the paperwork seems like a punishment if when this all gets formalized.
Abhinandan, what did you think of the VC circle sale? I mean, what do you think these guidelines had something to do with it?
I think Coril has weighed in on that, and I mean, I know some investors as well. I know news entrepreneurs. Certainly, there is a hesitancy of wanting to stay in this space, let alone just invest here. I mean, I have friends who have also, figured that yeah, it's getting messy now. No matter how good the growth seemed a year ago, can we get out? Can you give me an exit? And I don't blame those people. So, I mean, it would be speculative to say whether it did have something to do with this or not, but it would be a fair assumption to make. But I just also want to say that other than individuals, organizations like Kamaljeet's or mine, or they're like Scroll has millions of viewers. News Minute is up there with the kind of traffic they get. That's 1 minute silence for the third grievance redressal mechanism. Suppose none of us are dealing with them in a satisfactory manner, and we are spammed with a few hundred each. How many do you think will reach up there? How will they deal with it? I'm just asking, have they thought of that? I mean, I think we had the last time I checked, as far as news channels were concerned, in different languages, there were over 300 licensed news channels in the country among, all the languages.
And there are thousands. There are thousands and thousands of websites.
Now, if you have 10 per website, how many is the ministry going to deal with? So is it going to be like application of mind, or is it going to be nikalo?
Okay, so I'm if anyone wants to take this up, I'm going to read out some of the questions we've received. Rajat Mukherjee asks, has there been any attempt to define the cost of regulation for the sector, and what, if any, benefit might accrue to society? Anyone?
No, I think like most things, it's not that thought of, because again, this question assumes good faith. I challenge the very reason that laws are made are not good faith. It's not for robustness of an ecosystem or to make the news ecosystem better.
Okay. Arun, could you just upgrade Vanita Kohli Khandekar? I'd love to bring her in as well.
Sure.
Pranav Dixit asks, can you guys shed some light about how these rules might affect foreign media present here, like BBC, New York Times, and the Washington Post? Also, about foreign publications that don't have a physical business here, but have freelancers and correspondents writing for them. Neha? Neha, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'm here. I just want to pull out the text of the rules. Could you go over the fact situations again, Nikhil? One was foreign media.
So how does it impact foreign media? Also, foreign publications that don't have a physical business here, like the BBC still does have offices. What about publications that don't have a physical business here, but are freelancers and correspondents?
Got it. So if you have, I honestly think that the way the law is worded, it's wide enough to cover those situations as well, because there are two things that they talk about, right? One is if you have a presence in India, like meaning a physical presence in India. And the second thing says that if the law applies to you or the rules apply to you, if a publisher also conducts quote, systematic business activity of making its content available in India, unquote. And systematic activity is very widely defined, right? It's structured or organized activity, which involves an element of planning, method, continuity, or persistence. I mean, the intent, therefore, is to apply, is to have these rules apply fairly widely. So it's not contingent on you having a physical physical presence.
So in that sense, what's the penalty here? If you remember, the New York Times used to have a blog called India Inc. Without really having much of an operation here in terms of people. That's still because they have a blog dedicated to India. That is systematic activity. New York Times also takes subscriptions from Indian users. How would they be impacted?
So I think for, look, again, systematic activity would be it would differ. It would depend, right? If your website was by the way available or visible to users in India, but India really wasn't really a target market, so on and so forth. So then
most global publications take subscriptions now from Indian users.
Yeah. So
and they have offers dedicated to Indian users.
So really, I think it comes down to two things, right? One is there are two kinds of penalty. You go back to the IT Act, the Information Technology Act for penalties, because I don't think there's anything in the rules really. And there are two things then that this comes down to. One is you get penalized for not giving information when you should be giving information, in which case the penalty is for every day that you don't give information at something like 5,000 rupees. And the second penalty is for non-compliance, which is this sort of residuary penalty. Wherever there has been no other penalty prescribed, then you fall back on this penalty, which is a one-time 25,000 rupee penalty. So in just terms of what you, I suppose, like penal consequences you will face from the government, it will be this. Yeah.
Nikhil, to your point about systematic activity, they've defined it also. It says systematic activity shall mean any structured or organized activity that involves an element of planning, method, continuity, or persistence. So I guess having an offer which is for Indians, involves an element of planning, right?
And also, as per the definition of the publisher, even news aggregators and news agencies, they are also included. So news agencies like maybe, I don't know, maybe AFP or Reuters, or they could also be brought in. And news aggregators could be, I don't know, like probably like a service like Google News. Will it come under the rules? That is also a debatable question.
And by that definition, so do YouTube channels which have regular, or just Instagram, have a daily,
No, there are several YouTube channels that accept patronage and support from their viewers. I mean, Akash Banerjee started like that, so I guess that would also come under that. Vanita. Hi, I couldn't help but bring you in, Vanita. Sorry to spring the surprise on you.
Yeah.
But you had a question, and I was wondering if you have any comments.
My question was basically on because I'm a specialist by profession. Tomorrow, if I start a YouTube channel, Abhinandan raised that. And, for example, I read something called the Unearth Bulletin, which Lavish Bhandari brings out. Or, so what happens today, as I stand today, what does this rule mean for somebody like this? Even you, Nikhil, MediaNama.
Yeah.
What are you complying? Are you not? What does it mean for people like specialists? And then, of course, I'll make my broader comment if you want me to.
Well, just from my point of view, I still don't know which self-regulatory organization to register with, and the information form that they've sent has you have to give them that information. So I don't know whether to leave it blank, whether to write that we don't know which self-regulatory organizations are registered with the government, what to put in there. The rest of it, Grievance, for us, we've set everything else up. But that's one bit that I'm struggling with.
Okay. That's interesting.
Like what's and ideally I would not, Abhinandan knows this as well as anyone else, that I was a part of the initial discussions even before the name Digipub was decided. And I chose to opt out because I thought we're a specialist media publication, and therefore we shouldn't be a part of it. Otherwise,
that's interesting.
I'd raise my hand as soon, long before anyone else in Digipub had.
And I told Nikhil, they'll come after you also. Just wait. Don't think. Koi nahi bachega.
Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. So, and my thing, even to Abhinandan and possibly to Kanwaljit, though Kanwaljit is not involved. And the program code, by the way, the Cable Act was passed in '95. That was also under great duress. The broadcasting sector history is something I'm reasonably comfortable with. But you're right, it has never been questioned. And the only time it has been questioned is in the Madras High Court, when Star took TRAI to court and said that you cannot regulate our pricing because this comes under content regulation, and content regulation is not within the ambit of TRAI's powers. But eventually, the Supreme Court gave an ambiguous judgment on that one. So it's still not, so TRAI continues to regulate prices. Which is, if you remember, TRAI is meant to only regulate distribution.
Right.
And dheere karke they have, And they've screwed the television sector in the process. They're completely the television industry. But my question is, why is the digital news publishing industry, and this is something I asked to, I don't know how many of your participants are, why are you speaking in 3 different voices? That is the first thing you have defeated your very purpose. DigiPub, DNPA, and those 8 guys who are, this is a thing which I have seen for 20 years. I've covered this. I've seen it again and again and again. It's like piracy will attack a gap. The government will attack any gap in your unity as an industry, in films, in TV, in digital, across the segments I cover.
If I may, Vinita, I'm going to put Kavaljit on the spot on this because NDTV is a member of the DNPA. And sorry to do this to you, Kavaljit, but I'd like to understand about, the DNPA put out a statement saying that exclude us from these regulations. What's the consensus in the DNPA, and what have they communicated to the government? Instead of asking for these rules to be removed or not for no one to be regulated, what's the rationale behind asking only for digital arms of traditional publishers not to be regulated?
See, look, I cannot speak on behalf of DNPA. Obviously, it's a big body with traditional media companies of all sizes and agendas, right? I think the position taken by DNPA has always been that we have been in the news business for a long time. We have always been regulated, self-regulation, statutory bodies, all applicable laws. So please consider those while creating new rules, and don't include us. This is a stand taken by DNPA. And you can say that it sounds like hame nahi regulate karna, unko hi karo, right? Like by not adding them, it's like go for them. And I guess it's a take. All I can say is, like, as part of NDTV, that we have consistently emphasized freedom of press in all forums, including courts. We have been taken to court by CBI, income tax, ED, PMLA. Sab kuch mein we have gone to the court, right? And every time we have said that it's basically the same chilling effect, right? That you are trying to shut up a company which has always propagated freedom of speech and press, and that's a strong signal to other companies also. So, like, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of DNPA, but I know what has been put out, which is that we are already covered by NBSA or PCI or other bodies, so don't look at us when regulating. And I think if you try to extend that argument, you are saying go for the digital guys, and I can't take it. Like, I can't say anything other than that.
Sorry.
Malvika, you had a question. Sorry, Abhinandan, do you want to add something?
I was just saying that, I think it's unfair to put Kavaljit on the spot, but
I know
we've done but we've done a story on this, and it's titled on News Laundry. It's called "Is Legacy Media Muddying Waters and Claiming Digital Space?" In that, we'd sent questions to what's the gentleman's name, Mr. Pavan Agarwal, chairman of the Digital News Publishers Association.
Right.
The wishy-washy vagueness or not wanting to respond to questions demonstrates that, yes, they do want to throw digital under the bus. I mean, of course, no one's going to say that who's representing any, but otherwise, if you have a clear answer, you'd give a clear answer. Na? I mean, there is a reason. I mean, we are all in a news business. Some of us may be journalists, some of us may not. Like me, I'm no longer a journalist, but I was once. So I know when you have an answer, you get one. If you don't have an answer, you don't get one. So the vagueness.
we had invited Pavan Agarwal for this discussion, just to set the record straight on that.
The thing is that, and coming to Vinita's point, the thing is that on freedom of speech, I think there may be consensus. I mean, I still think that's unlikely. But wherever there is an overlap of commercial interests and business interests, like DigiPub, there's a reason that we are for digital only. While, many of my friends and other members of DigiPub, we have a great amount of respect and very good friends with organizations like Caravan, and who are doing amazing work. But the way the regulation was, there's an inevitability in conflict in broadcast and print and digital because of the way the rules are right now. So, there is an inevitability that you may not have the same aligned interests. I think that is why you have several bodies, and of course there are other reasons that are political. But
we'll not go into that. I'm sorry, but Malvika had a question for Manu. Malvika?
Thanks, Nikhil. Okay, I was actually at a different point in the discussion. It came up all of the different ways that Live Law thought that this was ultra-virus, that there's basically no authority to pass these rules, right? And to that, I wanted to ask Manu specifically, did you consider this whole interdepartmental committee, because I think that's something that has been really curious as well. What is it exactly? Because is it a quasi-judicial body? Is it a kind of tribunal? In which case you would need some kind of law to set it up. Can you set up some kind of a administrative tribunal through rules? And if so, if this is supposed to be a new digital media watchdog tribunal, are there any such parallels where these kinds of bodies are just set up? I mean, I don't know the press landscape as much, but yeah, since you might have considered it for your petition, I was just curious, how do you see this committee, and how can it even be set up in this way?
You're on mute, Manu.
Thanks, Malavika. You have raised a very valid point. If you see the structure of the interdepartmental committee, as per the rules, that acts like a second appellate authority over the grievance control mechanism of the media, and as well, it has also got suo motu powers to issue blocking orders under extraordinary circumstances. So yeah, you are right. It is kind of acting like a tribunal as such. It has got powers of adjudication as well as execution, and also receiving complaints on its own. So like this is one area of concern, because it's acting like a tribunal. It's acting like an adjudicatory body while being part of the executive itself. And this has been created through executive rulemaking, not through any legislation or not through any parliamentary process. So that is a very grave area of concern. So even during my introductory remarks as well, I was mentioning there is no independent adjudicatory mechanism as per these rules. So you are right. I agree with you that such a mechanism cannot be created through executive rules, and you need to have a statutory framework for that, which needs to go through parliament, through parliamentary discussions, etc. So
sorry. So I'm going to ask for brief answers because we're running out of time, and frankly, we have something like 40 odd questions left. Just a quick question, Neha. Pranay Jalan asks, would the rules apply to publishers operating in India, but perhaps servicing international markets? There are lots of media KPOs in India as well. How does that pan out?
So if you have a physical presence, like if you have an office in India, then in any case it applies to you. Or if you're running a systematic activity that we were talking about earlier. And so I think the use case that you're talking about there also would potentially be covered. Yeah.
Manu, do you think an alternative structure to this regulatory question is to make the PCI the third level authority?
I'm not sure about that. Even PCI is also, see, if you take the stance taken by the PCI also, they have been very pro-establishment recently. For example, when the Kashmir blockade was happening, you've seen what was the stand taken by the PCI. So we need to have a clearly independent agency for regulating media, and all over the world, the model has been of self-regulation, and that has been the model followed globally. So I have my reservations about PCI. So in that regard.
Kodil, what avenues of fundraising do media publications have? What possibilities exist for media publications who are beyond a 26% limit right now?
Do you mean to say that those who are already above the
who are above
restructuring? We'll have to restructure, dilute, do something. I mean, obviously you cannot raise further from foreign funds, but if it's domestic, I don't think anything really stops you from raising domestic money.
Okay. So I have one last question. We are way over time, but I do want to get into Section 69 over here. Both Neha and Manu, do you think Section 69A can apply to news and news publishers? What are your views on the applicability of Section 69A here, which basically allows the government to issue an order to block content? Neha? First Neha, then Manu.
Got it. Yeah, look, I think in terms of substance, yes, it can, but 69A is meant to apply to intermediaries, and I think the rules widen that to include publishers as well. So I think to that extent, you're going to have issues with constitutionality. But if it's a question of just content, can it apply to news content? Then I think the provision of law is wide enough to allow for that. The problem is that under the rules, they've included sort of publishers as well, and they've said that you can direct blocking orders, essentially, or takedown orders can be directed towards publishers as well, and that's the bit that I find problematic.
So Manu, just in addition to that, one of the things that I was wondering was that this is subordinate legislation, and can subordinate legislation also create new definitions? Because it creates definitions of aggregators, of digital news publishers, of OTT streaming companies. So just in addition to Section 69, could you address both?
See, a subordinate legislation has to keep confine itself within the boundaries of the Parent Act, the main statute. So the IT rules that cannot travel beyond the scope of the Information Technology Act. So the Information Technology Act cannot deal with, or if it is not meant to deal with news aggregators and publishers, etc. Certainly the subordinate legislation, they cannot define, or they cannot deal with those entities which are not meant to be covered by the Parent Act. And if such an attempt is made, that will be ultra vires the Parent Act. And in fact, that is one of our main grounds in the petition.
So there's also a question here from Alana Triscott about, is there any scope for international legacy media to nominate a local subsidiary as a publisher for the purpose of compliance without infringing FDI norms? Neha?
I don't think I know the answer to that top of my head, Nikhil. I'll have to look into this.
Okay. So that isn't that a double whammy in a sense, that they can't, they need to have a local office if they're servicing India and conducting business in India, and at the same time they will be restricted by the FDI norms. So does this mean that eventually foreign publications will be in violation of Indian law and therefore be blocked in India? Is that a possibility here? Manu, what do you think?
I'm not very well versed with that foreign media aspect as such. So maybe someone else can take that question.
Does anyone have any views on this? Udbhav, since you're already here. I guess some questions are unanswered, and thank you for all those questions. We've got many questions that are unanswered right now. We'll see what we can do and perhaps get answers from some of our panelists on these questions. But thank you all for a fantastic session. I figure we should have given this much more time. We're already way over time. Thanks, everyone. We'll move on to the next session, which is focusing on news aggregators and essentially, along with that construct, also looking at entities like Twitter, Facebook, Google News separately, perhaps applications like which are news bookmarking applications, Reddit as well. Like to invite the speakers for that session. Udbhav, Gusabad, Abhishek, and Matthew, if you could just put your cameras on. I think we're still waiting for some speakers here. Arun, could you just see if anyone needs to be upgraded?
Yeah, I'm checking. Okay.
So I'll start with you, Udbhav, in the meantime. Just a question about, the IT Act looks at intermediaries, and traditionally uh, aggregators have been intermediaries, which is that they merely perform the function of allowing the transmitting of information from one user to the other. And now there is a new definition of aggregators. Is there a conflict between these roles?
Thanks, Nikhil. I definitely think that there is, right? What's essentially happened in the new legal framework is that there have been two categories of sort of regulation created, one for intermediaries and one for digital sort of media organizations. But news aggregators, more often than not, sort of straddle both of those categories of organizations. A, because they definitely perform the functions of intermediaries in that they take content that they do not vet and merely make it available for users to consume. But under the rules, the obligations or some of the obligations that would apply to them definitely seem to be obligations that either require a certain, imply a certain amount of editorial control over that content, or otherwise, definitely in terms of like compliance of registration with the government, of ensuring that you have like personnel in India, so on and so forth, are definitely ones that don't necessarily apply to intermediaries. So I think when these rules were originally being considered, there were many examples from various industries and sectors that were given of how certain entities can both be intermediaries for some instances and not be intermediaries for some instances. And I think news aggregators are an example of that sort of conflict sort of becoming a part of law. And it'll be very interesting to see if certain requests are sent to news aggregators, whether they would be sent under the provisions of the Digital Media Code or under the provisions that apply to intermediaries, because under, at least in my sense, it's certainly possible that they can be sent under both in the present instance.
So just a related question from Yajas Setlur. What is the threshold to determine whether an entity is a news aggregator or an intermediary? The IT rules say that a news aggregator means any entity who performs a significant role in determining news and current affairs content being made available. Many intermediaries put in place mechanism to filter out or discredit fake news.
I mean, I think specifically with regard to intermediaries, one of the few good things about the new rules is that there is an actual sort of recognition of the so-called Good Samaritan principle that does allow intermediaries to carry out voluntary takedowns of content, which would include, I think, the instance of fake news that's just been described, and specifically state that their protection as an intermediary is not going to go away. But with regard to like the role that news aggregators play, the rules really don't envisage, I think, aggregators as like intermediary entities. They definitely place aggregators broadly at the same threshold as they place publishers of news and current affairs content. So I think the broader question of like, what is an aggregator? When do you become an aggregator? When are you just an entity that lets people bookmark links or store links? And I'm sure that we'll come to like sites like Reddit and Reddit and Dig, which in certain ways definitely like do some of the news and current affairs part. But apart from that, I think it's definitely a case where as an intermediary, you can do some of that segregation and like voluntary takedown of content, but as an aggregator, you cannot under the current rules. So if you do that, are you still primarily an intermediary, or are you no longer a news aggregator? Again, is an example of that conflict that I think the rules don't really envisage playing out so far.
And sorry, I just lost my trail of thought there, Udbhav, but do we, is there any way of improving this definition of aggregators to narrow it down and to separate them from intermediaries?
I mean, I would say that for the purposes or the objectives, no matter what they are behind the rules themselves, treating aggregators as intermediaries, which I think most aggregators would be more than happy to be treated as, is going to be fine, right? Like that would resolve many of these inherent conflicts, which still allow some of the broader sort of data sharing and content takedown requirements, and would also allow aggregators to play the role that they currently do in the ecosystem. So the first thing that comes to mind is to like carve aggregators out of the scope of digital news and that sort of entire code of conduct, because it's quite hard to imagine how they can both be intermediaries and follow many of those provisions at the same time. So that's the sort of first suggestion that comes to mind. Alternatively, if they don't want to do that, at a minimum, sort of like in the definition, accounting for or explaining if an intermediary is also a news aggregator, then whether they should be treated as a news aggregator or as an intermediary is, I think, the baseline minimum level of clarity that the rules should provide. And that's another way that some of the clarity I think may exist in the ecosystem, but it still won't necessarily solve some of the problems of aggregators being treated as digital media publishers will create.
So just to take the same question to Manu, sorry, to take the same question to Matthew Chacko from Spice Root Legal. Matthew, what's your view on this definition of aggregators and the confusion that perhaps it creates, and how can that be improved?
So I actually think that the definition of a news aggregator is one of the few things that whoever drafted this got right. It's a little different perspective from what Udbhav has. I think there is no doubt if you're and one of the problems is that when you say news aggregator, you know, all the children and grandchildren fathered and grandfathered by the RSS feed are news aggregators, right? Many variations of them. But if you look at 2O, which is what defines news aggregators, it says one, you need to play a significant role in determining the content. So that itself is a qualifier, right? You're not saying every aggregator is a news aggregator. The second thing is you're also saying that you need to aggregate, you need to curate, and you also need to present. So it's not a passive, let's call it a passive news aggregator. You're talking about someone who organizes this news, picks which one you read, which one you don't read. What is without a doubt is that all news aggregators, if you come under that threshold, are intermediaries. And that all news aggregators are also those publishers of online news and content or whatever, current events. That definitely, right? So, I mean, they may have gotten, the manner in which they've gone about this is a little bit around the world, not direct, complicated and all of that. But they've eliminated many people you and I would probably call news aggregators from the definition of news aggregators as under the rules. So to go back to your question of would someone who filters out fake news be a news aggregator? I don't think so. That's, to my mind, that is not the intent of the definition. Of course, we'll have to wait for either rules or for a decision to flesh out what a news aggregator is. But I'm fairly confident that if I was a lawyer arguing that merely by way of you filtering out fake news, you don't become a news aggregator, that's an argument I think, confidently make. Of course, I've recently read X versus Union of India, and many of the arguments I thought I could confidently make, now I'm like, okay, I can make them, but the Delhi High Court will disagree. But apart from that, jokes apart, I think they've got this one right.
So just in terms of, this particular construct of the definition, how do you think algorithms play into this? Because does this mean that there is a conscious human intervention, or will algorithms determining what news to surface, aggregate, and present will also mean that you're a news aggregator? Because if you look at the Delhi High Court Division Bench's view on active versus passive intermediaries, it basically goes out to say that the IT Act does not create that distinction, and so therefore there are just intermediaries, and an active role doesn't rob you of an intermediary status. So will you think the same thinking applies to news aggregation, where if it's just algorithmic and there's no human intervention and there is no so-called actual knowledge, would it still be deemed a news aggregator?
Not yet. Nikhil, let's look at the intent, right? If you were going to make that big a hole in the definition, then everybody would get away by adopting a very smart algorithm, right? I think the court would have to go one step beyond and say, does the algorithm aggregate, curate, and help in the presenting of data? Does the algorithm play a significant role, right? And secondly, maybe do I, as the aggregator, have control over the algorithm? Right. So just by designing the algorithm in a certain way, I can't get out of that part. However, if I just adopt somebody else's algorithm, let's say news as a service, for the lack of a better word, and I'm just plugging into an algorithm which is owned by somebody else who kind of curates, chooses, etc., then maybe I could get away from the additional liabilities or definitions that a news aggregator brings about. But Am I going to get away just because it's an algorithm, not a human? Definitely not. That would be a very, very hot day in Lutyens, Delhi in December before that would happen.
Gusabad, any views on algorithms and the definition of news aggregators?
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. And in my opinion, news aggregators are like the worst off in because of the rules, because they in the previous iteration of the rules, one, and even now one can understand some of their functions as qualifying as intermediaries, and therefore for protection from immunity from liability under 17(9). But what these and even now, if you look at the rules, they seem structured as creating two mutually exclusive categories. One is intermediaries and the subcategories thereof, and the second one is publishers and news media. But aggregators are following in both the brackets because of the function that they perform, which qualifies as an intermediary function, but they are specifically defined under the under part 3 and explicitly included under publishers. So now coming to Matthew's point about like there's a qualifier there, which is about performing a significant role. I think the qualifier is largely meaningless just because of the fact that it's not making any distinction between some human editorial function or an algorithmic function. Let's take an example of, let's say, the Google search function. If you search on it, there's a tab called news, and it will present you news articles on the keywords that you just searched for. And this is true for DuckDuckGo. Is this a news aggregator function? Is Google performing a significant role in determining this? It's Google's algorithm determining this. It's DuckDuckGo's algorithm determining this. This is not very, very distinct from. If the law is not going into the distinction between like human editorial control and algorithmic control, then we are in no position to say how this significant role will be determined. And therefore, this vagueness will only contribute to, one can imagine it will contribute to the provision being used to sort of intimidate or, place liability on entities which are supposed to have immunity from liability.
There's a question from Frederick. How does the law wrestle with the fact that these are complex algorithmic systems? For example, for Facebook, we're talking about the Facebook news feed, the Instagram news feed, the algorithm behind stories, video recommendations, etc., etc. All of these look different depending on whether you access them from mobile, laptop, low data version, etc. Kushabit?
Thanks. So this is again an example of why the news aggregator definition is like perhaps not the best way to look at the function that we're describing here. Now, are these news feeds playing a significant role in determining what we see in terms of news and content affairs? Absolutely, yes. And so, and the algorithms, as you said, like vary on whether you're not just on your personal preferences and the data that they've gathered on you, but also what device you're accessing it from, what network you're accessing it from. Therefore, in a layperson's definition, are they playing a significant role in determining what you see? This is absolutely true. But in the first part, in the first part of the regulations, which relates to intermediaries, what the law is saying that it does not say anything on algorithmic like news feeds, right? It doesn't address that. Udbhav mentioned a point that it does carve some sort of a good faith exemption for content moderation, but this does not actually address like news feeds or any sort of algorithmic targeting that may occur because of it. So this has been, I would say, the news feed has been like some unaddressed area under 79, and when we speak of it or in jurisprudence, even before these rules came. The news aggregator definition is only adding complexity to the already gray question that we had, which you pointed out.
Thanks, Gulshabad. Abhishek, from your perspective, how does an OTT platform like for example, you had Z5 and Hotstar both carrying news feeds, or just Hotstar live streams sports. So would this be construed as news, as a news channel? I mean, Hotstar has in between let's say in a cricket match or a football match, in between they have shows discussing developments as well. So one is pure play news channels which are being broadcast on these platforms, and second is when you have shows that discuss current sports affairs in a sense. How do these platforms get impacted by these guidelines of around news aggregators?
Okay, so I think we'll have to treat news and sports differently from each other. And the reason I say that is because even though the debate around it, or the manner in which aspects have developed, really hasn't given that distinction very clearly. But I'm going back to the intent expressed both from the point of view of the uplinking, downlinking guidelines, which on the basis of which channels are allowed to uplinking, downlink their signals into India, as also the then subsequently regulations issued by the TRAI. They make a very clear distinction at one level between news and non-news channels, and their sports falls in the domain of non-news. Secondly,
but then, if I may, Abhishek, as a counter, in the last session we discussed about how Cricinfo would fall under news. They have live scorecards and live commentary while it's happening, and they do have news related to cricket. And the sense that everyone had was that this would be, because of the broad definition of news and current affairs, Cricinfo would also get it would get covered by this.
Oh, so as I said, I don't agree with that view, because in my, at the end of the day, are we looking at it there from a definition of a, common man, from the understanding of what we consider as news? Is it something which is telling us something about a current happening or a current affairs related to the aspect of, sports or otherwise? Or is it a legal definition whereby there is already a determination, until such time that determination is modified or that thought process is changed? Clearly, the genesis of, and I'm here talking more from the point of view of television and broadcasts, not so much in terms of pure content, which may not be audiovisual. So from that perspective, clearly there has been a decision taken at a policy level to distinguish between news and non-news. And sports falls within the category of non-news. Secondly, even when you have a genre-wise distinction made under the TRAI regulations, sports and news come under different categorizations. And this is for the purposes of determination, of course, of your electronic programming guide and how you are going to be placing channels next to each other. So at least in the absence of any other determinator, there is clearly one indication that the policy determines that sports will be considered as distinct from news, even where there has been, there have been litigations in court in relation to IPL or other, cricket matches, where news channels sought to show a certain portion of the matches as part of, their news, 30-minute capsules or, highlights or whatever. And there the court was very clear that this is not news. It could be covered under broad terms of fair use for the purposes of reporting a particular current event, but there too you are limited in terms of a 10-second or a 30-second or whatever rule. So all along that distinction has been made, so which is why I'm putting sports in a different category. When it comes to the live news feed on these OTT platforms, the question that you put to me is whether they would be, so to my mind, there are two questions here. The first is whether that relay or making available of the live news feed of those channels on an OTT platform converts the OTT platforms into a news aggregator. And therefore, there are not only issues under the IT regulations, but also the 26% threshold that is required to be adhered to as per the foreign policy guidelines. The other aspect is whether by virtue of the fact that this content, the news content, is being carried on the OTT platform, does that news channel have to also adhere to the code of ethics to the extent that they relate to age classification and the classification of the content that is set out in the annexure to these regulations? So in my mind, those are the two aspects that need to be answered. And the answer, at least to the limited extent that I can give, and it'll all be, of course, subject to whatever interpretation the courts accord. But in my view, the content and the age classification that is applicable to online curated contents cannot extend to news contents. Not only because the two have exclusive definitions under Rule 2 of these IT guidelines, but also because of the fact that unlike entertainment content or films, which can be viewed in advance and therefore a classification can be provided, news is much more dynamic. You can't possibly have a viewing of a news content in its totality in order for it to be given that kind of a content classification. And therefore, if at all, the OTT platforms are today saying that I cannot carry news because I have to have each of my programs carry these classifications, and that's incorrect. The last part of that question, whether or not they will qualify as news aggregators, I think that they are in carrying the news content playing the role of a pure intermediary, because there they are not deciding on, they're not playing a significant role in terms of curation of the content that is coming online. It is the news content as is that is coming on that platform, and therefore to that extent it's a pipe, and in my view it will be an intermediary.
Do you see any conflict between the roles of intermediary and news aggregator? Do you envision a situation where one doesn't know which of the two it is? Because effectively, think about it now, Abhishek, the way the IT Act is structured, an intermediary is a function. It's not an entity. And so therefore the same entity can be both.
I agree with you.
Do you envision a situation where an entity doesn't know whether it's an aggregator or an intermediary, and
Nikhil, an entity can wear two hats. Very frankly, an OTT platform which is showing, let's assume, Netflix, Amazon Prime, etc. I'm giving you that. Sorry. Yeah.
My question is that if I'm an aggregator, and this is actually, I'd love it if everyone else could weigh in on this. If I'm an aggregator, if I'm an intermediary, and there is a situation where it's perceived that I'm an aggregator, will I know whether to apply the code of conduct that I'm supposed to apply? On what basis will I take that decision? And it's a difficult decision to take, isn't it? Can you envision a situation where that happens?
It's a difficult decision to take, Nikhil, but as you rightly pointed out, the qualifier for the intermediary is the function and not the entity, right? So therefore, in the event that I am being told that a particular activity of mine could be an intermediary function or could be an aggregator function, I will have to, in the extant framework, apply the principles of 79.2 and apply the principles of the definition of a news aggregator to come to a conclusion as to whether a particular function qualifies as an intermediary function or it qualifies as an aggregator function. I'll have to make that distinction on a case-to-case basis. And that's what I was giving you an example. And this is perhaps in relation to the aspect of, let's say, a Netflix. To the extent that the content that is coming on that platform is not a Netflix original, Netflix is playing the role of an intermediary. To the extent, however, that it is a Netflix original, it has to adhere to the online curated content guidelines. And in fact, that is the stand that the government of India was taking consistently in PILs that were filed up until November 2020.
But it can't be an intermediary.
We are going to be treating as an intermediary.
But it can't be, because it's effectively licensing the content and therefore is a publisher. It can't be treated as an intermediary.
I agree with you that the definitions that have come about in the IT regulations create a bit of a, I would say it's a very thin line whether you determine yourself as an intermediary or as not so much as a publisher to my mind, but as an aggregator. Because you are aggregating the content of third parties. In any aggregation situation, typically there will be a licensing arrangement in place. If there is no licensing arrangement, there could be issues of copyright infringement, but we're not going into that. The line is very thin. What is the level? And to my mind, the distinguishing feature, and subject to what the other panelists may also sort of weigh in on, the distinguishing feature is not just the significant role that I perform in determining the content, but also in curating the content. Now, unfortunately, our law nowhere has a definition of curation. What is the level of control or interference, if I can call it, that I can exercise with the program that is coming onto my platform for me to be qualifying the definition of having curated it? And that, I think, is an open question.
Matthew?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to be this irritating fellow who, hi Abhishek, long time, yeah.
Hi,
I'm going to be this irritating fellow on the panel who disagrees with everyone, and I so apologize for that again, right? So I think in Abhishek's conception of these issues, he sees intermediaries as one, and he sees aggregators / publishers as another. Correct me if I'm wrong, Abhishek. To me, I see intermediaries as the all-encompassing subject of the IT rule. And I see some kinds of intermediaries who will also be aggregators, and all aggregators will be publishers. And therefore, and of course, while I said that intermediaries, aggregators definition is what the drafters got right. I didn't say that they got everything else right? But if you were to make sense of this jumble, I think the only way a code could make sense is, everyone's an intermediary. Next step. Are you an aggregator? Yes, you are an aggregator if you play a significant role in determining the content. It doesn't say in determining the curation, because that's not what the definition says. So very legalistically, if you determine the content and play a significant role in that, then you are an aggregator, as long as you also play curation and presentation roles. If you're an aggregator, then if you look at the definition of that publisher of news and all of that, then you're definitely a publisher as well. So intermediary responsibilities flow to everyone. Aggregator responsibilities flow to some. And thereafter, you're also a publisher of news and current events. At least that's the way I tried to make sense of this. I'd agree with Abhishek that perhaps the persons who drafted this could have done a better job. Could have taken into consideration a lot of things that has been grappled with both in case law as well as in a lot of telecom issues that have come up.
Let me just put it simply. Perhaps the people who drafted this could have put out a draft version for public consultation and gotten feedback on how they had defined things, instead of just putting it out for everyone to just accept or contest in court. One of the tragedies of these regulations is that there was no public consultation, at least on the news and current affairs and the streaming, OTT streaming part of it.
Took the words out of my mouth.
Udbhav Ghosawat, do you want to weigh in on this discussion? Udbhav first.
I agree with some parts, disagree with some parts, but overall, like the larger point of the fact that these rules are clearly divisive and subject to varying interpretations for what is something like for a sector that I think would really value certainty is evidently very clear. So that goes to like the ways in which the definitions and things like that could be clearer. On the sort of more broader point and the focus on how this is specifically if you curate news and current affairs content and a bunch of the things that are present under the news aggregator definition, I think it's quite clear that at least most of the online platforms that I spend a lot of time on the internet will very clearly fall under that definition, because if you notice, it doesn't say anything about you primarily having to deal with news or current affairs content, but merely says that as long as you do those things with regard to news and current affairs content, then you can be called a news aggregator. And my Facebook news feed, my Reddit homepage, my Twitter feed, depending on the handles I follow, all of these are things that in various instances, if I were to be entity filing an FIR or a complaint who doesn't really read the law in a particular way, or if I were the government or a court and I wanted to interpret the law in a particular way, I think there is an incredible amount of leeway to make the news aggregator definition infinitely more complicated than I think we would all like it to be. So that's, I think, the larger point that I'd like to make.
Okay. Gushabat and Priyadarshini, if you want to jump in after this on this, please do. Gushabat?
Yeah, thanks. I think there are two things here, and I'll just go back to the example of looking at services that are definitely intermediaries in our eyes, right? Like, which are things like search engines. Now, if you again use DuckDuckGo, search for keywords, go to the news, it's definitely qualifying as a news aggregator, right? So this is not, we're not even talking about where the lines are blurred and there is so much control, or it's only licensed content that we're talking about curation, right? The example that we were discussing. I mean, for things where you are licensing content, it's clear that you should qualify as like a curated content platform or like a publisher. And I think like once we are, of course, discussing the merits or demerits of the definition, I think the point Abhinandan made, and of course Neha and Neha and Manu also made in the first point, is something that we have to keep in mind here, that the IT Act does not envision this sort of classification, categorization, and making onerous obligations on then these subcategories of intermediaries / non-intermediaries, right? If you are of the view that news aggregators are non-intermediaries, then they have no place to be regulated under the current IT Act, right? And if you are of the view that they are intermediaries, then the scope of obligations that are currently present on them through the rules exceed what is envisioned by the IT Act, right? So regardless of whether if you look at and the point Priyadarshini was making on the chat is that, like, often we speak of intermediaries as entities, but the IT Act is very clear that it treats intermediaries with respect to one piece of particular content / transmission, right? So I'll also be more careful in the way I speak about these functions and content, but the 2021 rules are also straying from that content specific, transmission specific definition of intermediaries, and are trying to regulate entities as a whole, right? And this is apparent when it says like registered users, you have to set up and set up grievance officer mechanism for what service, right? For what content? I just wanted to make the point that there are so many things that are egregiously out of the scope of the IT Act that we're arriving at these contradictions and confusions, and perhaps the legal challenges that were discussed in the first part are the only way to resolve this.
So I think there are a couple of comments I just wanted to read out. An anonymous attendee says that by definition, an intermediary cannot have liability for the content. This is directly in conflict with the liability that is being sought to be imposed on publishers of OTT or publishers of news content. Therefore, intermediary and publisher of OTT/news are mutually exclusive. And I think there's a headline comment from Arjun Sinha Roy who says that if opinions become news, then everyone will be covered. I think that's a great headline. Matthew, Gushabat spoke about the fact that these rules are so beyond the scope of the Act. Do you think that under subordinate legislation, these new categories of intermediaries could have been created? Is this legally sound?
So after the last time we had this argument about this, Nikhil, I went and read Shreya Singhal again. Now, I mean, generally as a constitutional principle, delegated legislation is flesh on the bones, right? And there's this word that we lawyers use, which is called ultra virus, which is basically, if you go beyond the scope of the IT Act, then obviously, like Gushabat said, it's problematic. It could be argued that it's unconstitutional. Where we disagree, and I, just before I begin on this, I'd just like to say that my two overarching reasons for why this could be unconstitutional Unfortunately, the courts do not support that as ground for unconstitutionality. One is that it's plain stupid, like it's really badly drafted. And two is what some of my friends who like the Constitution call the Don Quixote objection, which is that you're tilting against windmills, right? None of it makes sense. But unfortunately, none of the courts agree that those are valid reasons to strike down a law. But on the technical legal reason, the argument that these rules are beyond what the IT Act allows you to do. And I'll respond to you, Priyadarshini, one sec. That these rules are what the IT Act respond to you. I've looked at it 50 different ways. I'd love to say yes, because I hate these rules. But I don't think under present constitutional jurisprudence, there is grounds to say that the rules are ultra vires the statute. For example, does the statute allow content moderation? It does. The obscenity regulations, no matter how we flip it down, up and down, are content regulation. Is there scope online content regulation from a general reasonable man perspective falls within the scope of the IT Act. And therefore, I don't think, does it go beyond section 69A, which is what Shreya Singhal says it is? It does, but unfortunately, that's not the test because this is under 87(1) and 2. And 87(1) and 2 of the IT Act allows you to cover the entire scope of the IT Act. And nothing in Shreya Singhal talks about that. So I don't think those are grounds. Priyadarshini brings up something that's very interesting.
Sorry, I'd love to bring in Priyadarshini. Priyadarshini, could you unmute and explain your point?
Hi, hello everyone. Hi, Matthew. What I wanted to say is that your wishful desire of having a ground of challenge for a subordinate legislation, which is plain outrageous, is today probably incorporated as a test of manifest arbitrariness, which is no longer simply a test for principal legislation, but also for subordinate legislation, thanks to Justice Nariman. And so therefore, probably there is still some hope of fighting chance of contesting this in court, even on that ground solely. I'm saying there are other grounds, but since we are on this, probably that is still a ground.
Can I know
I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
I'm taking a lot of time, Nikhil, but can I respond to that one?
We love a good argument.
But I also guess I'm the only one on the other side, right? Everyone else thinks it's unconstitutional. Yes.
Matthew, in all fairness, sorry to cut you in all fairness, I think in large parts you are correct. Most of the arguments against the constitutionality are ambitious, but there are grounds to still strike the law down. That is where we slightly differ.
So let's go for that one. So manifest arbitrariness is a relatively newly fleshed out ground. There are embers of it, chapters of it in various old judgments. Yes, Justice Nariman, purveyor of all that is arbitrary, has brought in very, very clear indications that manifest arbitrariness, something that emanates out of Article 14. I don't think there is enough flesh on manifest arbitrariness to be a single ground of challenge, where 14, 19, 21 read together indicates that, hey, there is good reason why this should not be allowed. Manifest arbitrariness may allow an additional ground of, at least that's the way I read it, may allow an additional ground of, for saying that something is unconstitutional. But neither Puttaswamy nor Shreya Singhal indicate that where you have made silly classifications, which you don't, yes, and vagueness and overbreadth, yes, may Timothy Endicott rest in peace, but yes, and associated rules of vagueness and not enough breadth and all of that are all supportive grounds. There is, in my opinion, there is no judgment that the Supreme Court has said where clearly I disagree with the things that you have done, the classifications that you have made, and therefore I am going to strike it down. Has not been a position that the court has ever adopted, is not, to my mind, consistent with the constitutional. I'm going to seem like a constitutionalist, an originalist here, but and I'm not, but there is no judgment right now which says if the executive slash legislative goes around making silly rules and silly classifications, the court is going to sit in judgment in that. And I don't think the constitutional separation of powers allows for that. But I'd love to make that argument, Priyadarshini and Divij, that someday in court that this law, the classifications made by these rules are so silly that they are therefore unconstitutional, which is the heart of all our arguments, I think, Priyadarshini. But do correct me if you're Priyadarshini, do correct me if I'm wrong.
So, so first Priyadarshini, then Divij, if you want to respond. And I'd also like Rahul Narayan to weigh in if he can.
With regard to classification being silly alone, I think he's absolutely correct that there may not be sufficient ground to say that just because there is a silly classification that by itself is arbitrary or manifestly arbitrary. However, if we revisit one decision by Justice Nariman in cellular operators, if I remember it right, I'm just speaking off the cuff over here, where he had struck down a subordinate legislation for not being adequately tuned to realities, so on and so forth. So those are essentially the highlight grounds on which these present 2021 rules may possibly be challenged in a court of law successfully.
Darshini, once the opportunity for me comes to add to what you said, once Nikhil allows me to
No, please go ahead, Abhishek.
No. There are other, I'll get other people also to say what they want to say. But Matthew and Priyadarshini, I should be able to make out additional ground so that the manifest arbitrariness angle comes in as another argument to support that. But others, please weigh in before I can.
Divij?
I mostly agree with Matthew, and just trying to look at this from the lens of constitutional law arguments. I think there's different parts of this whole code which can be challenged in different ways. Maybe I definitely think like kind of challenges to the procedural part are a little more difficult. I think possibly the easiest part to challenge is the takedown provisions for intermediaries at large. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to moot an argument that it kind of rarely succeeds just because of the kind of breadth that courts have given to it from its conception, which is this argument of subordinate legislation not being allowed to make legislative policy. So the function of the legislation to actually accurately define the scope of a particular legislative policy has to be carried out by the legislature itself and cannot be delegated. So, there's like 7-judge bench of the Supreme Court in the Delhi laws case, which has said this, but in practice, it's very rarely applied. So the argument to be made here would be that, the regulation of news functions is a policy function completely outside the scope of the IT Act itself, which cannot therefore, is a kind of novel policy function which cannot be delegated through rules. Something to consider. I don't know if you're just throwing everything and seeing what sticks.
Thanks, Divij. First Rahul and then Abhishek, and then we'll close the manifest arbitrariness discussion with that.
Thanks for having me, Nikhil. I think as far as manifest arbitrariness is concerned, the court judgments are relatively clear. I don't know what, if there is an originalist argument against it, but that is neither here nor there. I think that if we meet if the challengers meet the conditions laid down for manifest arbitrariness, then of course it's a valid ground for challenge. And I think that's probably correct. I tend to agree almost completely with Divij. I think that this is also a solid point of challenge as regards the ultra wires aspect of the act and delegating legislative powers to subordinate legislation. That's absolutely right. The difficulty in all of these challenges is going to be whether we can tailor our challenge to these old established grounds. But the fact that the grounds exist, of course, is completely there. And again, as far as things like takedown are concerned, as far as issues like they are challengeable under standard grounds of chilling effect and free speech and proportionality and that. But I think manifest arbitrariness is its own ground, and I think there's a fairly, at least to my mind, there's a fairly solid chance of a challenge succeeding as to why these things have been clubbed together and why are they being dealt with in this particular fashion under the IT Act.
Abhishek?
Okay, so 3 grounds for a ceiling, what I think can be challenged to the vires and on grounds of constitutionality. First, to my mind, is these regulations seem to go, and I am here making a distinction between the regulations to the extent that they apply to intermediaries and to the extent that they apply to the others. These regulations have been notified under 87.1 and 87.2Z and ZG. Let's remove 87.2Z for a moment because that's 69A, no difficulty there. With regard to 1 and 2ZG, 1 is an overreaching power with regard to making of rules, but that's a generic power that is there in most statutes. We are specifically looking at the content of this regulation where the focus seems to be on intermediaries. And as Matthew said, you start off with that superset of intermediaries, and then you say, Acha, are you an exception, and how does one deal with you, etc. To my mind, 79, which provides the exemption from liability, the whole purpose of having a discussion around intermediaries is that these are the entities and or functions that are supposed to get that safe harbor protection from any allegation of wrongdoing with regard to third-party content, etc. One of the important aspects to remember is 79.2 says that you will get that safe harbor protection if you satisfy the following conditions. One of those conditions is that you should not select or modify the information contained in the transmission. When you are getting into the aspect of aggregation or online curated content or publishers of news, I think you are automatically getting into the zone of where you're not going to be getting protection. So the focus of the act, if it is to provide safe harbor to intermediaries, then it should be limited in that sense by way of these guidelines or rules to provide for those circumstances which need to be adhered to or followed by intermediaries for them to get protection under 79. So to my mind, by introducing anyone except a pure play intermediary for the purposes of regulation under 87.2ZG, there is a clear violation of the constitutional principle that is excessive delegation of power. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, and here I am coming into the domain first of the news publishers specifically, and then into the online curated content providers as well as publishers of news. In case of news publishers, there is a clear Article 14 violation in as much as, whereas you say that a facsimile edition of a newspaper will be exempted from these rules. So therefore, whatever is coming out in print, if you come out in the digital domain, exemption. These rules do not apply. But you allow for application of these rules for live streaming of news content, which is already in the television domain. So clearly an Article 14 violation, and I don't see any intelligible difference here to discriminate between, in my mind, the print as is. It's a question of the as is part. As is the print newspaper is being used in the facsimile edition, exemption, as is the news which is coming out on television, and which, by the way, that is already regulated, coming out in the digital domain, and therefore these rules seek to apply. So Article 14 violation there. The third aspect, to my mind, is a separation of powers issue. When you're providing for a 3-tier mechanism, where you have recognized, all right, at the first level, you as entities that are coming out of, as publishers of news content or publishers of online curated content, you have to provide for a mechanism of grievance redressal, no difficulty. Level 2, you provide for a self-regulatory mechanism where there is an independent body that does this. It's an association or a collection of all these organizations. And in order to recognize that there has to be an element of quasi-judicial power to be exercised to determine whether you are in violation of this regulation or of the law or not, you have made it a condition that the person should be either an eminent jurist or a retired Supreme Court or High Court judge. You then provide for a tier 3 mechanism where someone from the bureaucracy sits an appeal against that decision of a tier 2 tribunal or a self-regulatory entity, which is headed by the, so you recognize that it is important to have a judicial member who decides on this issue of liability, and then that subject that to the appeal by a bureaucrat. Clear issue on separation of powers. So to my mind, on these 3 grounds, these these rules can certainly be assailed. And of course, then you come in, bring in manifest arbitrariness, and you have your case. Over to the other experts.
Hi everyone, this is Advait. I'm just filling in for Nikhil for a bit. So Mr. Malhotra, just to go back to that separation of powers aspect, in the previous panel we had talked about this is neither an independent arbitrary body, arbitration body, neither is it part of the judiciary, nor is it a tribunal where I have certain statutes, or there's a CRPC sort of process to this. Do you think your arguments could strike it down on that aspect, that this is, you already have the Press Council of India, for instance, on the press, but it's been called a tiger without teeth because it has no enforcement powers, and there's no real arbitration done really by the PCI. It can take up cases when it wants. Under such a framework, it would be forced or compelled to keep responding to various grievances. So do you think your case, what do you think of that argument that this IDC is neither an arbitration panel nor a tribunal? Where do you situate it in that framework?
You're talking about the tier 3 mechanism,
tier
which is the IDC. Right?
Correct.
No, so IDC is straight out, to my mind, it is, you are forming a committee. So, okay, just stepping back, this process in relation to the television broadcasting business already exists, by the way. So, independent of the self-regulatory mechanism administered by the BCCC for the non-news broadcasters and by the NBSA for the news broadcasters, if there is a complaint received by the MIB that there is a violation of the cable television, the program code, advertisement code, or otherwise, the MIB can issue a show cause notice, ask them to file, a broadcaster to file a reply, and then there is an interministerial committee that is formed, which sits from time to time to actually look at such show cause notices and to adjudicate upon that. In my view, that in itself is an issue of violation of separation of powers doctrine, and that in any case is subject matter to challenge in 2 writ petitions pending before Supreme Court. One filed by NDTV, the other filed by Viacom. But what happened there is, it's an independent process. You have a self-regulatory mechanism of BCCC or NBSA, but this interministerial committee did not sit and appeal against such an order. If someone was unsatisfied by the outcome or a decision given by the NBSA or BCCC, they could independently approach the MIB and start off the process under the Cable Television Act. The deterrent factor for broadcasters to adhere to the decisions given by BCCC and NBSA is that in the event that they don't follow it, there could be a trigger to go before the MIB, which could then result in a strike and ultimately a suspension or cancellation of their license to broadcast. Right. So that's what keeps the self-regulatory mechanism ticking and working. But as I said, there was no true senses an appellate mechanism provided under the IMC that you will sit and appeal against the decision of the NBSA or BCCC. By this tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 structure, you're actually providing an appeal against a decision supposedly given by a panel which is headed by a judicial officer, retired judicial officer, and then being decided by a bureaucracy. I think that's a clear violation.
So, Mr. Chako, Siddharth Vadrajan of the Wire called this weaponizing grievances. So, as a journalist, I see certain areas, certain use cases where a grievance mechanism would be required, right? If, for instance, defamation or, for instance, any factual errors that you've made and you've attributed that to someone, the person being defamed or quote being wrongly attributed has a direct process to appeal to the channel instead of trying to find an email address or a mobile number anywhere. But have you seen these sort of grievance redressal mechanisms anywhere else in any other industry where the channel for opening or filing a grievance is so wide? The reasons or the use cases that one has to respond to a grievance is so wide. So anything from just a plain objection to an actual reason that the editors or the OTT platform might find worthwhile to discuss or deliberate on.
Matthew, before you answer that question, just give me 1 second. I'm really sorry for this intrusion. But the fourth argument I forgot. The fourth argument for challenging the vires and the challenge is that other than intermediaries, when you're getting into the domain of news and current affairs in the digital domain and online entertainment content and films, there is also a separation that has been carried out by the Allocation of Business Rules 1961, where there was a notification in November 2020, where specifically these 2 aspects of content were handed over to the MIB. These rules, for the first time, and this is the first time I've seen it, that the MeitY under IT Act issues the notification And there says the nodal ministry for enforcing Rule 8 onwards, Chapter 3 is MIB. It's completely unheard of in any jurisprudence, and that's the fourth. And that actually points out more towards manifest arbitrariness. Sorry.
Clearly, Nikhil, my fear is that if I answer both of these, I will be talking for the rest of the call. Should we
we need to move to other topics.
All right. But Advait and Abhishek, we should grab a cup of chai sometime and talk about it.
Absolutely.
So just we've got Sushant Sinha here from Indian Qanun, a website all of us read. Sushant, are you a news aggregator or a news publisher under these rules? And are you planning to send something to the ministry?
I have no idea. I mean, I'm just listening to everyone, what is happening around. I mean, we already have been so many issues with on the legal front, on especially right to be forgotten and everything, that this is a new thing. I mean, we don't host any news, but we host legal content. And we are aggregating legal content, but it is not news. It is not
court orders uploaded in such quick time would be current affairs effectively.
So, I think my understanding of the legal situation is that I would, at this point, I would just claim that Section 79 doesn't apply to me. Better route.
Fair enough. Udbhav, do you think Indian Qanun is an aggregator? News aggregator?
I think it depends, but I mean, my instinctive answer would be no. And I would largely say that because at least from all the times that I've used the site and it really helped me sort of get through law school. So thank you, Sushant. Is very much a website that sort of posts judgments as they are, and as they become available, rather than doing any form of analysis on them. So I think if a website that merely directly only publishes, say, press releases that people send out without modifying or changing anything exactly as they receive them would be a news aggregator, then I think that there's a possibility one could maybe argue for Indian Qanun, but I don't think that realistically exists, but I find it quite difficult to imagine Indian Qanun being considered to be an aggregator, because they do aggregate content, but I don't think it's neither news nor current affairs content, but are judgments.
What about the first page of Google? I mean, that's a discussion. They've said that they're not, Google search isn't a social media intermediary, but is the first page of Google where news content is shown as aggregated? Is Google search effectively a news aggregator?
I would say that both, the example that you gave about Google search, the sort of row of content that exists on YouTube called news that has curated news publishers that have content. The fact that Facebook, in certain instances also highlights or promotes news in certain ways. There are definitely many instances where online platforms do certainly exclusively display news that their algorithms curate and come from a select list of publishers, that I think, at least under these rules, would certainly, one could make the case, or the government certainly could, that why aren't you complying with these aspects of the rules? Because for that particular part, so okay, if you're as a search engine, if you're not an aggregator, that's fine, but for this section, if we want some content removed from it, who should we contact, right? Just at a minimum, that's, I think, a demand that we can certainly imagine the government making, because I think the intention behind including news aggregators under the purview of these rules was very much that it was to make sure that it's not just the publishers of content, but also the entities that bring all that content together, being allowed to be a vector that for such sort of content takedown. So it's very likely that we'll see that happen.
So if there are news aggregators, then that leaves us with the other side of the problem, something we discussed in the last discussion. Then the FTI norms would apply to them.
Yeah, I think that that's, and I'm sorry that I think you'd raised a very similar question earlier, at the end of the last discussion, and I just didn't get the unmute button on time as well. I think that entire FDI bit is if anything, FDI law in India is enforced by lack of enforcement, right? it's a law that and guidelines that exist in a certain way format, but it's only when when the enforcement directorate launches an investigation against you that it really become a thing. And I think that this is definitely one of those cases where there is clearly multiple pieces of opinion on what can and cannot happen.
But if I may, news entities, including aggregators, have been asked to also send across their shareholding structure.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that in this case, if those letters have gone to these platforms, then they will be sending those structures across. If they haven't gotten these letters yet, then they will probably have a letter ready somewhere that they will send if that demand comes down their way. And that's I mean, in general, that's sort of how foreign direct investment in India, especially for sectors like this, is enforced. So I think the fact that it hasn't happened so far, or there is a lack of clarity, is very much the desired outcome in the regulatory scheme of things, in that people should be a little wary. There shouldn't be too much investment. If there are ways of exercising alternative pressures upon these entities, that they should be available. And I think that's exactly what is taking place.
What about bookmarking services, like Delicious, Instapaper, or a company which Mozilla acquired, Pocket? Do they get impacted?
I mean, I would say there, any web page or anything on the internet that has a URL that can include news content as well, but similar to how the first page would be made, that for bookmarking services, you can just also bookmark news and current affairs content, but the vast majority of content that is bookmarked on these platforms by users is not news and current affairs.
These services which are now under the definition of aggregators, but maybe slightly confused whether they qualify or not. There's a case. Sorry, am I audible?
You are. But we can't see you.
Hello. Yeah. Right. So, sorry, I just have a patchy connection. I was just saying that for all of these entities that may be confused about whether they qualify as aggregators, international or domestic, right? There's I would say that the nature of 79 should be taking precedence over how one should act on it. So therefore, using 79, the immunity as an active defense, right? Nothing. What happens if you don't meet the conditions of 79? That your protection from liability for third-party content is not applicable anymore. Right. So even that has to be a case-specific. I mean, dealt in a case-to-case basis. So. Yeah, I'm speaking more to the nature of 69A and 79. Yeah. So that's the way I look at it. We are supposed to look at it as an active defense measure used by intermediaries. And
as an add-on to that, Gosabit, what do you view as a threshold for an intermediary to be a news aggregator? What's the threshold?
I would say that the only qualification seems to be a significant role and in determining the news, right? So there's two qualifiers in that definition. I would say, as I said earlier, the two parts, regardless of the legality of it, I'm not going into that now. I'm just saying the two parts were seemingly supposed to be mutually exclusive. News aggregator is the place where we're stuck, where it may be qualifying as both, right? Now, when it is qualifying as both, I think what should be taking precedence is the fact that the source of these rules is the intermediary liability provision. Therefore, you I don't know, if you are truly operating as an intermediary, as most news aggregators are, right? When we're discussing the threshold, I would just like us to remember that if you look at the definition of news aggregators, it is so broad that lots of the news aggregators are actually intermediaries, and that's the protection and the sort of I mean, that's the 79 active defense is what they ideally should rely on.
Matthew?
Complicated question, but I think the difference between let's say someone who does not have liability and someone who has responsibility and liability, probably this is guesswork because we don't know how courts are going to look at it, would probably depend on how significant the role is in choosing what content comes up first. I'm in court right now in Bangalore to say that a certain particular search engine who uses an algorithm to decide what kind of content comes up, and you can pay some money to get that content up there, ought to be liable for infringements, etc., and responsibility around that content. So I think eventually courts are going to come down onto that principle, which is if either you physically, I mean humanly, or you through choosing and picking and applying an algorithm, or you by taking money, promoting certain kinds of content, then you are not an intermediary. You're making money out of it. You're playing an active role. And therefore, then your safe harbor provisions go away. That's both an acceptable, to my mind, that's not a big leap from international jurisprudence on intermediary liability. I don't think any of my international content clients would particularly be bothered by that summary. However, whether that is exactly where all the pieces play out and fall and all of that, I don't think we know as of now. But that would be my guess.
So can just as the next thought is, can the liability of an aggregator be the same as that of a publisher? Because it seems to be the same for both when there's a significant differentiation in the function, essentially, right?
The question is, does a publisher get out of liability by saying they're an intermediary? Definitely not, right?
No, that's not. I'm saying that can the liability of a publisher and an aggregator be the same?
Yeah, I think what the regulator, what the drafts person is trying to say is that instead of seeing this as one black and white, you're aggregator, you are not publisher. I think what we should understand the draft person is saying is there are some cases where an aggregator acts very closely like a publisher. And in those cases, I am not going to let an aggregator get away from liability by saying they're an aggregator. Right? And this probably goes against the interest of many of my clients. But at the risk of that, right? If you choose, if you curate, if you promote, then your ability to say I am an aggregator, I am not a publisher goes away. Right? So it's not all aggregators. It's one special class of aggregators who play a significant role. And I think there's a good policy argument to say that this should be fine-tuned, fixed, clarity brought about. I think there's a good reason to say that if you're choosing and arranging all the news that I'm reading, then you're not an aggregator, then you're actually a publisher. I think that's a valid argument from a policy perspective.
Okay, there's a question for Udbhav from Pranay. To what extent could intermediaries harp on the Good Samaritan principle in voluntarily removing content under 3.1b? Also, assuming a case where the Good Samaritan principle hasn't been introduced, does the intermediary stand to lose safe harbor for removing such content?
Thanks. I think that on the first question, in my personal opinion, there's like a reasonable sort of scope for them to rely upon the so-called Good Samaritan provision. But I think Gushabad mentioned it early in the panel as well, that it definitely doesn't explicitly encompass like all voluntary content takedowns, but just those covered by 3.1b. And I think what content does or does not fall under 3.1b is an interesting exercise. For example, like Gushabad and I were chatting, and Gushabad mentioned spam as a category of content that may not explicitly fall under a 3.1b category, but one that intermediaries do tend to take down voluntarily. And therefore, I think it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in courts, which it likely will if people decide to rely upon it and the government or someone else contests the fact that they enjoy this freedom or this protection as a sort of Good Samaritan in this case. So it's definitely not a very clear provision. But it's better than what was before. And that comes to the second point, right? Which is it's almost like a hypothetical question that what if this provision had not been introduced? I think it's very clearly was a gray area under Indian law that was pretty much tacitly left unaddressed so that platforms could deal with the amount of content that they deal with and can continue to carry out the takedowns that they do. And it's a good thing that it's been referenced in at least some form in the current law. For example, at least globally, the gold standard of a Good Samaritan provision principle is the one under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act that explicitly lets them sort of do whatever they want with that content, which is of course being contested, and there are like many people who are saying that needs to be watered down even under Section 230 globally as well. So this is not to say that that's exactly the approach that we should take, but this Good Samaritan provision is nowhere close to the clarity of that the Section 231 does, but is better than what we had before.
Divij, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. Also, before that, just if I may, a short point on kind of the stay on kind of content moderation broadly and how it might be regulated. Okay, right. Hi. A provision of 79 which has completely been left ignored by court so far is the requirement that intermediaries do not modify content. The scope of modification is, as a general legal term, is incredibly vast. Nobody's really spoken about what that means or really tried to explore or go into what that could imply. And depending on how it's really interpreted, if ever, it can be broad enough to cover all kinds of information ever published on any online website, or narrow enough only to cover specific algorithmic mediation of content. So, that aside, and thanks, Udbhav, your intervention was really interesting in clarifying that. My question was, and something I've been trying to grapple with, and I'd love to hear from all the panelists and also anyone who's kind of been speaking with news publishers here, is on how is part 2 of these rules intended to be enforced? In that, what is the legal, penalty that publishers should be wary of, and what is the, what's the expected enforcement of this likely to be like? Apart from, it's been called a self-regulatory code. To my mind, there are 2 things that could potentially apply in terms of requiring, news aggregators, publishers, etc., to enforce this. One is the residuary penalty under Section 45, which applies to affected users and therefore may not even apply in this case, which is a residuary penalty for anything kind of any kind of offense or non-compliance with rules. The second is 69A3, which applies specifically to particular directions issued under 69A1, right? So not to kind of general non-compliance with rules, which is the rules under 69A2. So 69A3 links with 69A1 and directions there. As such, there's no clear regulatory enforcement of part 2 of these rules, right? One thing, again, which I was thinking, but isn't really clear in the rules itself, is how orders under 69A to be issued after the three-tier thing happens. One thing that could happen is that like the committee frames an order and a direction under 69A1, which is then meant to be enforced there. But there's no clear link here. That's kind of the anticipated method where, one of the reasons under which a 69A1 order can be issued is linked to the conditions of part 2 of these rules. And therefore, through the back door, there's an enforcement requirement under 69A3. I know that this is a little bit confusing, but basically my very basic question is, what happens if you don't comply?
Shobhat?
Thanks, Nikhil. On maybe both the points
and also just we're running out of time, so brief interventions, please.
Yeah, thanks. So on the 2 points, like I think what Divij pointed to is right. Like we do need more jurisprudence on the 3 conditions that are set out in 79 to understand what is permissible and what is not permissible. There is only one, I think, judgment that talked about modification of the transmission, and that was in the MySpace cases, where MySpace, of course, was converting the audio track by uploaders into another format, right? And maybe inserting ads in the middle algorithmically. And the court said that's fine. Like that's not what 79 means by modification. And of course, we have lots of actual modifications happening by intermediaries, like BSNL inserting ads into HTTP pages, etc. But that is, since it's beyond challenge, no one questions it. The second point is about selecting the receiver of transmission. And I think that's why where news feeds and sort of algorithmically selecting content has a sword hanging over it, because essentially what you're doing is, even if I'm friends with all of you on Facebook, Facebook decides who sees my post, right? You can see it and not. In that layperson telling of it, it is selecting the receiver of a transmission. So we do need,
it's the same with many other services, including Google News and many RSS feed readers like Feedly, which prioritize certain news for you based on your reading habits. Flipboard, Pulse, so many of them have used algorithms to determine the receiver of news.
Right. And so in the 2021 rules, the Good Samaritan provision or allowing for content moderation also still doesn't address these concerns that have been like a 79 problem for a while. And of course, as Udbhav was saying, like it doesn't cover spam. It doesn't cover specific communities that want to moderate content on their own basis, right? So we do need that wide allowance, which can only perhaps come through amendment of the IT Act. On the 69A point, I think the simple answer seems to me that the new rules are creating a parallel mechanism with the blocking rules, but will have the same sort of penalty as 69A. So I'm imagining this as part 2 was separate from these intermediary guidelines. And there's like 2 sets of blocking rules now. One is the blocking rules under like just 69A and this like ethics code. And the punishment for non-compliant seems to be like the same, right? Which is 7 years under 69A too.
Okay, very briefly, I'd like to bring in Geeta Seshu. Geeta, you were making a few points in chat. Could you share them with us?
Hi. I think it's this has been really very interesting, and there's still so many questions I have. Many of you have looked at it from a very legalistic point of view, I think. So I think we need to look at the issue of what actually is news and what these rules are going to do in terms of boxing news in and regulating it, especially in the digital world. In print media, we have seen it has failed. In broadcasting news media also, it hasn't succeeded, though it had a better chance than what happened with print. So what is happening here is a convergence of these kinds of media, print, broadcast, video, everything. And so I think we need to, we obviously have a situation where we are reacting to what the government has given us. We are not able to figure out how we would like news in the digital world to be regulated. I don't think we have even got to discussing that. I remember, Nikhil, you had discussions and public consultations on this several years ago, which I was part of. But we've not taken this forward. We really haven't. Now we are stuck with reacting with what the government has done for us. So that I think is a big problem. About India Qanun, it doesn't seem to be processing content in any way, apart from just putting it out. So it may be an aggregator, but it's not a news aggregator. I don't see it as a news aggregator.
Well, there is a point. There's a question from Isana who says that building on Utbhav's point on Indian Qanun, would SEC, Manupatra, etc., which edit judgments, be news aggregators?
Yes. Anything that I haven't seen Manupatra, but I'm sure that if they have reworked and repackaged the basic judgment which India Qanun puts out, then they are in some way processing the content. So I would like to look at it more closely and see if they are then news aggregators. Are they categorizing it in some way? Are they then reformatting it for a public purpose? I don't even know what the purpose is.
Thanks, Geeta. So I have to shift tracks. I have a few important questions remaining. Abhishek, I'm going to throw 2 at you. Firstly, are both the program code and the press council, the content code and the press council of India guidelines applicable to an online news entity, since it's mixed media? And do you see any areas of conflict between the two?
Okay, so while it is not clearly delineated in the regulations, like a lot of other ambiguous stuff, to my mind, because there is no clarity on, as you rightly said, it's mixed media. So there could be some audiovisual contents, there could be some which is purely written content, printed content in the digital context. The program code certainly cannot be applicable to non-audiovisual space. So whereas the journalistic code of ethics was originally evolved in the context of print media, the code of ethics and the principles enshrined there would, to my mind, could be applicable to the audiovisual domain in addition to the program code. But the same is not true of application of program code to the non-audiovisual media. So for the non-audiovisual media, it's only journalistic code of ethics. For the audiovisual media, it's possibly both.
So secondly, in terms, is there a requirement of an SRO for news aggregators? And is there any risk of coercive action against news aggregators in the absence of an SRO for them?
So look, while we've debated on the definition of news aggregator, but the whole purpose of the definition is that it falls within the scope of a publisher of news and current affairs content. The only place other than the definition that news aggregator, that word is used, is to qualify as one of the subsets of publishers of news and current affairs, right? There is no independent manner of regulation specifically concentrating on the news aggregators. So if it is falling within the superset of a publisher of news content, then clearly the publishers of news content fall within part 3, which is the part to which the SRO process applies. Then by that analogy, it will apply to news aggregators as well. And in the event that news aggregators do not have that mechanism, well, the question is that if you don't have an association of news aggregators, how will you go about in setting up a mechanism? Because then effectively level 1 and level 2 will be the same if you're setting it up for just one individual. So you are effectively, and possibly while discussing this with you, Matthew, I have my fifth ground of challenge on constitutionality. Are you forcing me to create an association as a precursor to following these regulations? So, question is open.
I know. I mean, we still don't know which SRO to sign up with, whether there's even one available for digital media. But that aside, 2 questions for Udbhav. Can news aggregators be asked to take down content on the, for example, Indian variant under the IT rules? Can the government ask them to censor particular phrases? And secondly, when news aggregators when news publishers aggregate via services, are they aggregators or are they publishers?
Thanks, Nikhil. On the first question, I would say, yes, there is definitely no reason for the government to and the current sort of 3-tier mechanism that has been set up for digital media to not issue orders that would require coverage or the deletion of certain words or certain keywords, and for them to be issued against news aggregators. So I could definitely imagine an order being issued that said don't collect or showcase any article that contains these terms or talks about a particular topic. And that's a pretty scary thought. And on the second question, which is around news wire services, I think it's an interesting one because there are definitely a bunch of services and many prominent publishers do this. You may notice that they'll have a headline, they'll have a full article. In the last 3 lines of that article will be, this is from an automated feed and MediaNama, as an example, did not process this content in any form and is not liable for it, right? So there are actually some ways in which publishers utilize news feeds and essentially aggregate them and also disclaim liability for their content because they haven't really published them. And this is, you can find this on NDTV, on First Post, on Hindustan Times, and on a bunch of other sort of places, for example. So I think that's definitely something that the law certainly hasn't envisaged, and I'm not very sure whether they want to cover them in that format. I would say the immediate answer to be they're certainly publishers, so many other parts of the law apply to them anyway. But whether they are specifically news aggregators or not, because there are no separate obligations upon news aggregators, they're just obligations that are upon publishers of news and current affairs content. I think it may be a slightly moot question because the rules apply to them anyway, but it is an interesting one to resolve nevertheless, especially with regard to the liability of publishers for aggregating those buyer services on their platforms.
Thanks, Udbhav. Manu, just a final comment from you on I don't think you commented on this one, but the applicability of the rules on international aggregators. What's their liability? Can they be banned? What's the level of regulation for them? Matthew?
Again, we don't know very clearly because there are no detailed rules yet. But my take on this was that generally, yes, they could be banned, they could be liable, and they could be banned if they have India-focused business activities.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew. Last question, Gushabad. I know it's probably a long one, but if you've looked at the code of conduct, what do you think is the impact on free speech online from an aggregation perspective? Because a lot of our access to news comes through aggregators.
Yeah, thanks, Nikhil. And so first, even on the code of conduct, the same legal point sort of stands. Even if you do not take the scope of delegated legislation argument that was discussed in detail here, 69A allows content takedown only for particular grounds, and those relate to national security and public order, etc. They're not as expansive as they're not all of the Article 19.2 grounds. So morality and decency, for instance, are not included under 69A. If you look at some of the code of conduct, it includes some of content which is relatable to morality and decency, even though, one can discuss if it goes beyond 19.2. So that's like another way in which it, it's even beyond the scope of 69A, some of the code of conduct content here. And we already have evidence of how such instruments are used, right? Like while the case was taken back against a digital news publisher in Northeast India, it's often used, like these regulatory mechanisms are often used as a blunt instrument to intimidate news publishers. One can imagine that news aggregators might face similar threats, and we've seen in the case of Twitter, for instance, where the hashtag selected as like trending become like a topic of contestation, right? Like we're in that territory now. Like what do these aggregators and platforms prioritize? That is also under sort of great scrutiny by the state as well. So that's the even in those areas we can sort of begin to see straight threats of censorship or punishment. I think broadly the rules just depart so much from the IT Act that it's a shock to everyone. But on specifically like media freedom, I think when treating news aggregators specifically, the government needs to make up its mind, right? Like whether it wants to treat these aggregators as intermediaries, whether it wants them to exercise some or little or no control over what they do, or have this expansive code of conduct which they need to behave by. The new rules are putting news aggregators in this very, very like peculiar and precarious position from just the contradiction that appears there.
Then it's very clear that they want them to be treated as publishers of content. Sorry, there's one really interesting question that I want to end with. And either Udbhav or Gushabad, if you want to take this up. An anonymous attendee is asked, will these rules be applicable to an entity that merely uses the YouTube API to embed YouTube in its app? If the entity selects the YouTube videos that will be visible on its app?
My instinctive answer is actually no, because I assume, and this is like applying like I don't know, like the golden rule of interpretation. We're supposed to avoid absurd outcomes, so that's the answer here. But generally, I'd say we need to focus on, like when we speak of news aggregators, I think one should be safe and assume that intermediaries which are dealing with content broadly, right? They won't be under this sort of scrutiny.
But there is curation and selection taking place over here. Udbhav?
Yeah, for specific functions that does apply, but not for, like, let's say YouTube like a service at large, or using their API.
No. So someone's creating their own app, Utpav, and they're embedding YouTube videos to provide a highly curated experience for news content experience for users.
Yeah,
What happens there?
I think that if that content is news and current affairs content that entity is choosing, then for the purposes of that function, it like could be a news aggregator. If you're picking and choosing which news items a user should see on your platform, regardless of how you do it.
Even if it's embedding YouTube videos, which are publicly available on YouTube.
I would say so. Like, I mean, it's most news articles that aggregate are available and are by some other publisher. So I think the YouTube API is just a way to bring that content onto that app. It could be an XYZ API and perform the same function, and that video could be hosted on Vimeo, DD Motion. It would perform the same function. But I think if that app is picking news content, putting it in front of a user, and is picking and choosing what that content is going to be, then regardless of whether they do it by a video API, like a YouTube API or any other API, for the purposes of that function, I think they would be a news aggregator because they are doing exactly that, aggregating news for the user.
Thanks, Imrav, and thank you all for a fascinating discussion. This has been intense, and I can only say that I wish we'd had these consultations prior to the guidelines to these rules being issued. We did have discussions and consultations for the intermediary part of it, even though it seems like very few of those inputs were actually taken into consideration for the finalization of that part of the rules. But there's been none related to news and current affairs and also OTT streaming, apart from private discussions with just the industry. So I do hope that there is some change in these rules going forward, if they're not junked altogether. I'd like to thank all of you for engaging with us and for a fantastic discussion. We also really appreciate the support extended by Google for this discussion. We'd like to thank our community partners, Webinpay and the Center for Internet Society for the support. We will be writing about this discussion on MediaNama and also compiling comments into a report which we'll submit to MIB. If you wish to revisit the stream for this discussion, especially if you're planning doing any research on this subject, it's on our YouTube channel. Thank you for participating once again, and don't forget to subscribe to MediaNama. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys.